It was my third month working the night shift at Oak Ridge Regional Hospital, a mid-sized facility tucked along the outskirts of a quiet town in Pennsylvania. I had transferred from a busier urban hospital in Pittsburgh looking for a slower pace and more manageable hours, but night shifts in Oak Ridge turned out to be anything but peaceful. I worked as a respiratory therapist covering the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. Most nights were uneventful. Patients asleep, corridors dimly lit, a constant low hum of machines the only sound. The staff was minimal after hours, maybe a handful of nurses on each floor, one doctor in-house, and the occasional wandering tech or custodian. I didn't mind the solitude, not at first. One of my first weird experiences happened a little after 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. I was checking the ventilator settings on an elderly patient in room 324, a woman named Lorraine who was in the ICU for respiratory failure. The room was cold, colder than usual. I remember adjusting the thermostat on the wall, but the temperature didn't change. It stayed uncomfortably chilly. Lorraine was asleep, her chest rising and falling in time with the ventilator, when I heard what sounded like whispering. It was soft, too soft to make out words, but it came from just behind me. I turned around quickly. No one was there. The curtain rustled slightly, but there were no windows open, and no one had entered. I thought it might have been my mind playing tricks on me. Night shifts mess with your senses, especially during those dead hours between 2 and 4 a.m. Still, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, similar incidents piled up. Once I walked past the pediatric wing, which should have been empty at night, and I saw one of the rocking horses in the play area slowly rocking back and forth. There was no child, no parent, no breeze. I stared at it for a full minute, willing it to stop on its own. It did, but not gradually. It just halted mid-rock, like someone grabbed it. I told Carla, one of the night nurses, about the odd things I'd seen and heard. She just gave me a knowing look and said, "You've met them, haven't you?" She wasn't being sarcastic or mocking. Her voice was flat, resigned. "Met who?" I asked. "The others, the ones who never left." She told me Oak Ridge had a reputation, even if the administration wouldn't acknowledge it. Built in the 1950s, the hospital had seen its fair share of tragedies. An outbreak of tuberculosis in the 60s, a botched evacuation during a fire in the 80s, and a string of patient suicides in the early 2000s. And though departments had been renovated and renamed, some rooms never seemed to lose what they'd witnessed. There were stories about room 509 in the West Wing, where a nurse reportedly hanged herself in 1998. Now the call button from that room would light up randomly at night, even though the room had been turned into a storage closet. Maintenance blamed faulty wiring. But then how do you explain voices answering when you radio back? I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But I couldn't ignore the growing number of unexplained events I kept encountering. My radio would squawk with static at exactly 3:17 a.m. every few nights. Once, it even played a woman's voice muttering what sounded like, "He's not alone." I tried recording it once using my phone, but it picked up only silence. When I played the audio back later, my phone locked up and shut down completely. When I rebooted it, the file was gone. One night, a critical alert was called overhead. Code blue, room 210. I ran toward the room, assuming someone needed immediate airway support. But when I got there, the door was locked. I pounded on it, yelling, but no one answered. That room had been unoccupied for weeks. I looked through the narrow glass window and saw nothing but a neatly made bed and an empty chair. Security arrived minutes later and used their master key. We walked in together. The bed was undisturbed. The monitor was off. Nothing had triggered the call, and no one had been near the room. The nurse's station confirmed it hadn't even been charted for cleaning that week. But the lights had been on when I arrived, and I swear I heard beeping before the door opened. Beeping from a monitor that wasn't plugged in. After that night, I started logging every incident in a small notebook I kept in my scrubs. Every time something unexplainable happened, I wrote it down. Date, time, description. It became a ritual, almost like I was trying to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. That journal now has over 40 entries. The last few are the ones that still make me question if I should have ever taken the job. There was one night in particular I'll never forget, Friday, December 17th. Snow was falling hard, and only essential staff had made it in. The hospital was quieter than usual. Even the generators buzzed softer, like the entire building was holding its breath. I was assigned to monitor a patient recovering from an asthma attack. Teenage girl, stable, light oxygen support. I had just finished my check-in and was heading back toward the elevators when I noticed a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a man in a hospital gown, barefoot, tall and thin, his face half hidden in the shadows. I assumed he was a confused patient. That wasn't unusual on night shift. I called out, "Sir, you okay? You need help getting back to your room?" He didn't respond, just turned and walked slowly down the hall, around the corner. I followed. The hall curved into the old surgical wing, which was decommissioned last year. All the rooms were supposed to be locked, the lights off. But as I entered, every light flickered on. Every single one. The hallway buzzed to life, and at the far end stood the man. Only now, his back was facing me, and he was standing in front of room 6, the old OR that had been shuttered since the fire. I stepped forward cautiously, calling out again, "Sir, that area's off limits." He disappeared into the room without opening the door. I blinked, confused. The door was still shut. No sound. Just silence. And then, behind me, I heard the softest exhale. I turned. No one. I opened the OR door. It was pitch black. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The room smelled like burned rubber and something else, like copper, sharp and metallic. In the far corner, I saw movement. A shape, slumped over, shuddering like it was crying. I took a step forward, and my flashlight beam landed on a surgical gurney. The figure stood. It was the same man, only now his hospital gown was soaked in blood from the chest down. His mouth opened impossibly wide, and he let out a sound I can only describe as static mixed with a scream. I ran. I didn't look back. I bolted out of the surgical wing and didn't stop until I reached the ER. They didn't believe me, of course. I couldn't explain why I'd left a patient unattended, or why my scrubs were damp from sweat and the knees torn. I couldn't even find the hallway again. When security walked me back later, it was gone. That entire section was sealed behind drywall for renovations, apparently for months. I requested a transfer the next day. They moved me to days temporarily, but I knew I couldn't stay at Oak Ridge much longer. My last night shift was in February, and I've refused all offers since then, even during staff shortages. I never told my new coworkers in Harrisburg why I left Oak Ridge. But sometimes, when I'm walking past a quiet hallway late in the day, I'll hear that same exhale behind me, or the whisper of footsteps where there shouldn't be any. And every now and then, my phone buzzes at exactly 3:17 a.m. I never answer. Story the end. I worked the night shift at a private rehabilitation center on the edge of a quiet, wooded suburb in Pennsylvania. The place was small, only 12 patients at a time, and it catered mostly to elderly individuals recovering from surgeries, strokes, or long-term illnesses. It was quiet, clinical, and oddly peaceful most nights. But there were a few shifts, especially during the winter months, when the hallways got too quiet and the shadows stretched too long. That's when things would start to feel off. The building itself was old. It had been a private residence in the 1940s before being converted into a hospice in the late 70s. Later, it changed ownership and functioned as a rehab center. But the bones of the house were still there. Narrow hallways, creaky hardwood floors, uneven doorways, and a cellar that always smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The owners had tried to renovate it with fresh paint and LED lighting, but it still felt like a place full of echoes. My shifts ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was just me and one nurse named Angela on the overnight rotation. She mostly kept to the medical station, updating charts or administering meds. I handled rounds, helped patients to the bathroom, and monitored the security cameras in the office across from the kitchen. One night in mid-January, a deep freeze had settled in, and the building's boiler system wasn't keeping up. The temperature in the halls hovered in the high 50s, and some of the patients complained of drafts in their rooms. Angela and I handed out extra blankets and space heaters where allowed. Around 2 a.m., I went to check on a patient named Mr. Halpern, a quiet man recovering from a hip replacement. His room was at the far end of the west wing, which used to be the home's original master bedroom. When I knocked and entered, the lights were off, and Mr. Halpern was asleep, mouth open, breathing lightly. But the room was freezing. I walked over to adjust the space heater we'd left him earlier. That's when I noticed it was unplugged. I was certain I'd plugged it in. Angela had helped me distribute them just after midnight, and I specifically remembered plugging his in because I had to move the nightstand to reach the outlet. I assumed maybe Mr. Halpern had unplugged it by mistake, so I plugged it back in and turned it on. As I left the room and gently pulled the door closed, I heard something behind me, quiet footsteps, like someone barefoot shuffling on the hardwood floor. I turned back. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a second, scanning the dimly lit hallway. The overhead lights in that part of the building had a habit of flickering, which added to the unease. Still, I shook it off. The place always made weird noises at night. Old pipes shifting wood, wind against the siding. Back at the nurse's station, I told Angela what happened. She gave a half laugh and said, "Don't start with that haunted crap again." I grinned, but I knew she'd heard stories too. The day staff sometimes talked about strange noises coming from the basement or call lights going off in unoccupied rooms. One nurse, who no longer worked with us, swore she saw a woman standing at the end of the hall at 4 a.m. every night for a week. Said she was pale and wearing a nightgown from another era. No face, just the shape of a woman. But that nurse quit without notice, so no one ever really pressed the issue. About half an hour later, the security monitors in the office started flickering. The feeds cut in and out, displaying static across some of the cameras. It happened now and then during storms, but the weather was dry and clear that night, just cold. I tapped the side of the monitor and waited. Eventually the feeds returned, but 2 camera views remained black. One from the West Wing hallway outside Mr. Halpern's room, and the other from the basement entrance. I got a sinking feeling in my gut. I thought of the footsteps. Without telling Angela, I went back down the hallway to check on Mr. Halpern again. As I passed by the other rooms, everything seemed normal. No lights on, no sounds. But when I reached the end of the hall, I noticed something strange. His door was open again. Only a few inches, but enough that I could see the space heater's light flickering inside. I knocked gently and stepped in. Mr. Halpern was still asleep, undisturbed, but the space heater unplugged again. The cord lay coiled near the outlet, and I knew it couldn't have fallen out on its own. I plugged it back in, slightly unnerved now, and stood there for a minute, watching the heater hum back to life. As I turned to leave, I caught a reflection in the small wall mirror above his dresser. It was brief, barely a second, but I saw what looked like a figure standing just behind me. A shape, not fully defined, like someone draped in a white sheet or a gown. No detail, just presence. When I turned around, there was no one. I backed out of the room slowly and closed the door, this time making sure it latched. I returned to the nurse's station, shaken, and told Angela everything. She looked at me for a long moment, then reached into her locker and pulled out a small wooden cross. She wasn't especially religious, at least not outwardly, but she said her grandmother had given it to her years ago for protection. She handed it to me and said, "Just keep it on you tonight, just in case." I pocketed it and tried to move on with my duties. Around 4 a.m., all hell broke loose. Every patient call light lit up at once. The entire board buzzed and blinked like a malfunctioning carnival ride. I looked at Angela. She looked at me. "That's not possible," she whispered. We both stood there frozen for a second before grabbing our radios and heading in opposite directions to check on everyone. I took the West Wing. As I moved from room to room, each patient looked up at me with the same puzzled expression. None of them had pressed their call buttons. In Mr. Halpern's room, he was sitting up now, breathing heavily, sweat on his forehead. "I saw someone," he whispered as I walked in. "A woman. She was at the foot of my bed." His eyes were wide and unfocused, but his voice was steady. "She didn't have a face." I tried to calm him down, adjusted his pillow, and offered him water. Then I saw it. The space heater was unplugged again. I didn't say anything this time, just stared at the outlet. When I got back to the nurse's station, Angela was pale. She said 2 patients had said the same thing. Woman in a gown, no face, just standing there watching them. That was the last straw for both of us. We decided to review the overnight camera footage on the DVR, especially from before the feeds went down. We scrubbed through a few hours worth of video from the working cameras, hallways, kitchen, med station, At about 1:58 a.m., the camera near Mr. Halpern's room caught something. It was quick. For a second, just before the feed cut out, a dark shape moved across the frame. Humanoid. Tall. Too tall. And then the static. The basement camera didn't come back online until 5 a.m., but when it did, we caught a chilling image, a figure standing just inside the stairwell, unmoving. The resolution was grainy, but it was clearly a person, white or perhaps pale gray with what looked like long, matted hair. No discernible face. No motion. When I blinked, the figure was gone. The frame cleared. Angela and I just sat there, staring at the monitor, unsure of what to say. The sun was rising and our shift was almost over. When the day staff arrived, we said nothing, just gathered our things and left. That wasn't the last incident. Over the next few weeks, more patients reported seeing the faceless woman. The heater in Mr. Halpern's room would never stay plugged in. Eventually, he asked to be moved to another room, and when he was, he slept soundly every night. The empty room stayed unused after that, despite the rehab center being consistently full. One night, a new hire on the night shift, Tim, was assigned to check the basement after another electrical hiccup. He never came back up. Angela found him 20 minutes later and sitting on the floor by the furnace, staring blankly at the wall, muttering, "She's down here. She lives down here." He quit the next day. I stayed for 2 more months, but the unease never left. I kept that wooden cross in my pocket every night. I never walked the West Wing alone again. Eventually, I found another job, day shift at a hospital an hour away. I never looked back. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning when I can't sleep, I think about that monitor image, the shape in the stairwell, watching, and I remember what Mr. Halpern said, eyes full of fear. She didn't have a face. Story the end. I used to work night shifts at a senior care facility just outside of Richmond, Virginia. The building was older than most of the people in it, with creaky pipes, flickering lights, and a musty scent that no amount of disinfectant could cover up. We were understaffed, underpaid, and constantly sleep-deprived. Most of the younger nurses couldn't handle the overnight shift, so the facility leaned on floaters and part-timers like me. I didn't mind it at first. It was quiet, calm, and I didn't have to interact with too many people. But that was before I started noticing things I couldn't explain. It all started during one of those slow, dead silent nights. The kind where time crawls and the silence presses against your ears. I was making my rounds, checking on patients in the East Wing. That wing had the oldest part of the building, and some of the rooms still had wallpaper from the 1950s. It was known for the worst of the plumbing problems and where the light bulbs always seemed to die first. There was one room, room 211, that always gave me a weird feeling. Nobody was ever assigned there for more than a day or two before they were moved. The last person who stayed in that room was an old man named Walter. He'd been in hospice care, quiet and mostly unresponsive, and passed away a couple of weeks into his stay. Nothing unusual about that. He was 92, and his heart had been failing for a long time. After he died, room 211 stayed empty. Officially, it was under maintenance, but nothing ever seemed to get done in there. No maintenance guy ever entered, and when I asked my supervisor about it, she shrugged and told me not to worry about it. One night around 2:30 a.m., I was walking past room 2111 when I heard coughing coming from inside. Deep, raspy coughing, exactly like Walter's used to sound. I froze in the hallway, my skin turning cold. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a cough echoing from another room. I took a deep breath and moved on with my rounds. About 20 minutes later, I was in the break room pouring some coffee when the nurse call light for room 2111 flashed on the monitor. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds, trying to understand what I was looking at. That room wasn't occupied. The system shouldn't even be active in there. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the East Wing. The hallway seemed darker than usual, and I swear the temperature dropped as I passed room 209. The overhead lights buzzed and dimmed as I walked by. When I got to room 211, I hesitated. The door was cracked open just slightly, though I distinctly remembered it being shut earlier. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was dark, but moonlight filtered in through the blinds, casting long shadows across the empty bed. The nurse call button was sitting on the pillow, like someone had deliberately placed it there. I didn't go inside. I just closed the door and walked away, pretending I hadn't seen anything. For the next few nights, I avoided that end of the hallway unless I absolutely had to pass through. Still, strange things kept happening. A wheelchair would be left in the middle of the hallway with no explanation. Lights would flicker and die only in that part of the building. One night, I came around the corner and saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, back turned toward me. I thought it was a patient who had wandered out of their room. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I walked closer, maybe 10 paces away, and the hallway was suddenly empty. No one there. No sound of footsteps. Just gone. The worst part came about 2 weeks later. It was a stormy night with thunder rumbling low in the distance and wind rattling the windows. Around 3 a.m., I heard the overhead speaker crackle. Static at first, then something faint behind it. It sounded like someone was mumbling. The words weren't clear, but the voice was low and familiar. It stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I called the other nurse on duty, Angela, to see if she'd heard it, but she'd been downstairs restocking the supply closet. She thought I was just tired, maybe hallucinating. I wanted to believe her. Later that night, I was doing my final round through the East Wing. As I walked past room 211, the door slowly creaked open in front of me. It was like someone was standing behind it and pushing it open slowly with a hand. I froze. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The room was colder than the rest of the building. I could see my breath in the air. The bed was neatly made, but the pillow had a deep indentation, like someone's head had been lying on it. The chair by the window was turned to face the bed, and sitting on the chair was a set of deep impressions, as if someone very heavy had just gotten up. My flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, I saw something that made me almost drop it. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room, tall, hunched, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. The figure didn't move, but I could hear the faint rasping sound of breathing. Then it spoke. "Cold in here." The voice was rough, rattling, and unmistakably Walter's. I ran. I didn't tell anyone for days. Who would believe me? But I noticed something change in the building after that. Patients started complaining about someone watching them at night. One of the residents, Mrs. Halley, who had mild dementia, told me she'd seen the tall man standing at her door at night. Another patient said they woke up to someone sitting on their bed, staring at them. Angela had an encounter a few nights later. She was walking back from the linen room when she heard someone whisper her name. Not just once, but over and over. She said the voice followed her all the way down the hallway, but no one was there. She took leave the next day and never returned. The worst incident happened about a month after the first time I heard Walter's cough. A new resident had been placed in room 211. He was a transfer from another facility. Within 2 days, he began showing signs of severe anxiety. He refused to sleep, kept asking who the man in the room was. We tried moving him to another room, but he became unresponsive during the transfer and died within the hour. Cardiac arrest, they said, but the timing was too eerie. After that, management finally locked room 211 permanently. They boarded up the door, sealed it, and told us to keep quiet about it. But even now, sometimes when I walk past the East Wing, I still hear the muffled cough, or the soft creak of a chair. And once, just once, I heard the overhead speaker whisper again, just a faint voice saying, "Still here." I don't work there anymore. I left after one final night that made it impossible to stay. It was a quiet Tuesday night. I was working alone because our other night nurse had called out sick. Around 2 a.m., I took my usual coffee break and came back to find the east hallway lights flickering wildly. Every other hallway was fine. I went to the maintenance room, but all the controls were normal. As I turned the corner toward the East Wing, every light down the hallway turned off at once. I stood at the threshold, staring into the darkness. Then I saw the silhouette. At the far end of the hall, by room 211, a figure stood still, barely illuminated by the moonlight from the window. It began to walk toward me, slowly, steadily. My legs locked up. I couldn't move. As it got closer, I could see its face, sunken eyes, gray skin, lips that barely moved. And behind it, more figures began to appear. Not just Walter, others. People who had died there, maybe. I recognized one of them as Mrs. Halley. She had passed just a week before from pneumonia. I stumbled backward, broke into a run, and didn't stop until I got outside. I sat in my car until sunrise. That was my last night on the job. I didn't quit formally. I never went back. Sometimes I dream about that hallway. The overhead lights buzzing, the cold air, the whispering voices. I've tried to tell myself it was stress, sleep deprivation, maybe hallucinations. But deep down, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know there are things in that building that never left. Story the end. I started working night shifts at a small, privately owned retirement home in rural Indiana. It was a modest facility with only 20 residents, nestled between dense woods and cornfields. The building was old, built in the early 60s, with creaky floors, long, dim hallways, and that ever-present smell of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. The owner, Mr. Simons, was an old man himself, nearly 80, and still lived in an apartment connected to the East Wing. He hired only a few staff members for night duty, mostly to cut costs, but also, as he used to say with a chuckle, because the dead don't need as much attention as the living. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, usually alone, except on Fridays when a nurse named Helen joined me to do overnight medication rounds. Otherwise, it was just me, the quiet halls, the low humming of fluorescent lights, and the occasional flickering bulb that no one bothered to replace. It started on my third week. I was making my rounds around 2 a.m. Most of the residents were already asleep, tucked in with their oxygen machines and night lights. I walked past room 112, which had been vacant since I started. It was always kept locked, though I never asked why. That night, as I passed it, I distinctly heard whispering, soft, rhythmic, almost like someone praying. I paused, leaned closer, and held my breath. It stopped. I tried the doorknob. Still locked. I even glanced under the door with my flashlight, but saw only darkness. I wrote it off as someone with a TV on, or maybe a neighbor talking in their sleep. The walls were thin enough to hear a pin drop from down the hallway. The next night, it happened again. Same hallway. Same time. The whispering returned, only this time it was more urgent, almost pleading. It wasn't words I could understand, just the tone. Desperate. Scared. I tried the door again. Locked. I stood there for several seconds longer, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand when I felt a breeze pass by me in the hallway. None of the windows were open. There were no vents nearby. It chilled me to the bone. That night, I asked Helen about room 112. She paused while refilling her medication cart, then looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before, like someone weighing whether they should tell you a secret you might regret knowing. That room used to be Mr. Arnold's, she said. He passed a few months before you got hired. How? I asked. Hung himself, in the closet. I felt sick to my stomach. Helen continued, her voice low. He was dealing with dementia, paranoia mostly. Said he saw people in his room hiding in the corners, claimed they whispered to him every night. The staff thought he was just deteriorating, normal for someone his age. He started writing things down in notebooks, gibberish mostly. We found a bunch after he died. Do you still have them? Helen shook her head. His daughter burned them, said they were disturbing. The next few nights, I did everything I could to avoid that hallway. I changed the order of my rounds, stayed in the nurse's station longer, even made up excuses to work in the kitchen where the old security monitors were. But it didn't matter. One night, as I sat in the station watching the monitors, I saw movement outside room 112. A shadow, tall, slow-moving, like someone pacing in front of the door. I squinted, leaning in. Then it stopped and turned toward the camera. Though the feed was graysquare, I saw eyes, black, hollow sockets staring directly into the lens. I jumped back from the monitor, my heart racing. When I looked again, the hallway was empty. I forced myself to go check against every instinct in my body. When I got there, nothing was out of place. The hallway was silent. Room 112 was still locked. But when I turned to leave, I heard a creak behind me. Soft, deliberate. I spun around. The doorknob to room 112 was slowly turning on its own. I backed away slowly, the flashlight shaking violently in my hand now. The knob stopped, and I bolted down the hall without looking back. After that night, I asked Mr. Simons if I could be reassigned to the laundry room or kitchens during my shifts. He said no, of course. You're not here to fold towels, he said. The residents need you. I didn't argue, but I began taking small breaks in my car, parking on the far end of the lot near the tree line. One night, I was outside around 3:15 a.m., trying to calm my nerves with a cigarette. The sky was dark, moonless, the woods behind the facility humming with summer insects. That's when I saw a light flick on in room 112. I knew for a fact that no one had gone in or out. I put out my cigarette and sprinted back inside through the side door, down the hallway. The light was off again, but the door was open. I stood there, frozen. Room 112 hadn't been opened in months, not by anyone on staff, not for cleaning, not even for maintenance. I peeked inside. The room was empty, bed stripped, walls bare, closet door ajar. Something in me told me to look in the closet. I didn't want to, but I did. There, scratched into the wood of the closet wall, were hundreds of markings, like someone had been clawing at it for days, and above them a single sentence carved over and over again in erratic handwriting, "Don't let them in." Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around so fast I almost fell. The hallway was empty, but I wasn't alone. From the room, a whisper, this time clear. "Help me." I slammed the door and locked it, ran back to the nurse's station, and sat in the chair until sunrise, every light on, every monitor turned toward that hallway. I didn't sleep that day. When Helen arrived for her Friday shift, I told her everything. She believed me. She said I wasn't the first to hear things in that hallway. One nurse had quit mid-shift, just left her badge and drove away. Another claimed she saw Mr. Arnold standing at the window of room 112 weeks after his death, tapping the glass like he wanted to be let out. I should have quit then. I wanted to, but I needed the job. Bills, rent, life. It doesn't wait just because you're scared. So I stayed. The last night I worked there was a Saturday. I had tried to convince myself nothing had happened, that maybe I was exhausted, imagining things. Around 4 a.m. I was making my rounds. I passed room 112 again. The door was locked now, the light off, everything normal, until I heard someone crying. Not just crying, sobbing, from inside. It was a man's voice. I checked every room nearby, everyone accounted for. Then I did something stupid. I unlocked room 112. It was dark inside. I stepped in, turned on the light, empty. Then I heard it again. Sobbing. From inside the closet. I opened it slowly. There was no one there. But on the ceiling of the closet, scrawled in what looked like blood or something close to it, were 3 words. "They're in me." The light flickered and went out. The door slammed shut behind me. I screamed, slamming my fists against the door, but it wouldn't open. The sobbing grew louder, more voices now surrounding me, whispering things I couldn't understand. Cold fingers grazed my neck. My head felt like it was caving in from the noise. Then, silence. The door opened on its own. I ran. I didn't finish my shift. I didn't grab my things. I just left. I never went back. A month later, I got a call from Helen. She'd quit too. Said something wasn't right at that place. 2 new night staff had already left. One of them, a guy named Rick, had gone missing after his second shift. They found his car still in the parking lot, but no trace of him inside the building. The last place he was seen, near room 112. I moved states after that. Got a day job at a library. I don't talk about it much. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. And sometimes on especially quiet nights when the air feels too still, I hear that same whisper in my head. "Help me." And I wonder if I ever really left that room. Story the end. It was the winter of 2017, and I had just started working the night shift at a regional hospital in Ohio, about 30 miles outside of Columbus. I was a patient transporter, one of those people who moves patients from room to room, takes them to imaging, or sometimes just delivers paperwork and meds between departments. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I liked the quiet that came with working nights. Fewer people, less chaos. The hospital was old. It had been built in the late 1940s and had gone through multiple renovations over the years, but the bones of the place hadn't changed. There were parts of the basement and lower floors that still had original tile and yellowed lighting, places that felt like time had stopped moving. The hospital had 3 wings. The new West Wing, all glass and polished tile, the older East Wing where I usually worked, and the South Building, which had once been a psych unit before it was shut down in the early 2000s. That South Wing was mostly unused, except for a few storage rooms. Sometimes we were told to avoid it entirely, even though the service elevator closest to the morgue went through that side. I remember asking my supervisor about it during my first week, and all she said was, "Just don't linger there. People say it gets weird." The morgue was down 2 floors from the main entrance in a dim hallway that ran behind the old ER. It always smelled like bleach and cold steel, and even though it was where we dropped off expired patients, I'd never felt creeped out by it. Not at first. My shifts were typically from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The first couple of weeks went by without incident. Mostly I helped nurses move patients from the ER up to rooms or responded to calls from the ICU. But then came that one night in January. Snow was falling in heavy sheets, and most of the non-essential staff had left early. The hospital felt empty. Even the ER was quiet. Around 2:15 a.m., I got a call from the 4th floor ICU. A patient had passed, and I was to transport the body down to the morgue for processing. That wasn't unusual. Night shift meant I handled most of those transfers. What was strange was that the elevators near the ICU were out, so I had to use the older service elevator at the east end of the building, the one that stopped right by the south wing corridor. I remember pausing when I saw that on my route sheet. I'd never had to go down that way before. Still, it wasn't like I could say no. I took the gurney up to the ICU, signed off with the nurse on duty, and carefully transferred the sheet-covered body. A man in his early 70s, the nurse said. No family around. Died quietly in his sleep. The elevator creaked and groaned on the way down. It smelled like machine oil and copper wiring. When it opened, I was greeted by the dim hallway of the south wing, its faded linoleum floors stretching into darkness. The hospital kept most of the lights off in that section to save power. Only every third light buzzed weakly above. The walls were painted a strange beige, chipped in places, revealing the greenish tiles underneath. I pushed the gurney out and turned left toward the morgue. The silence was thick, like sound was swallowed by the walls. My shoes echoed too loudly, and I found myself moving faster without realizing it. About halfway down, I passed a closed double door with a small square window. I looked through it as I passed and saw nothing but darkness inside. I kept going. Then I heard it. A soft clatter, like something metal had been dropped. I stopped. I listened. Nothing. I glanced behind me. The hallway was empty, the doors shut. Maybe something fell in one of the utility rooms, I told myself. I kept walking. Another 10 feet and the gurney wheels suddenly dragged like I'd hit a bump, though the floor looked smooth. I had to push harder to get it moving again. And then I smelled it, something that wasn't bleach or hospital sterile. It was sweet and rotting at the same time, like spoiled fruit. I stopped walking and leaned over the body, thinking maybe something had spilled. Nothing. The sheet was clean. Then I saw movement in the reflection of the stainless steel wall to my right. A flicker. A dark shape, like someone walking behind me. I turned around. No one. But now the hallway felt wrong, like it had shifted slightly. I couldn't explain it. Everything was the same, but also wasn't. The lights were dimmer, the air was heavier, and the gurney suddenly felt like it weighed twice as much. I picked up my pace. The morgue was just ahead, behind a thick white door with a security keypad. As I reached it, I heard a whisper. I swear it came from right behind my left ear. A rasping, breathy voice that said, "He's not alone." I spun, heart hammering. No one. Nothing. But now I was shaking. I punched in the code, dragged the gurney inside, and practically slammed the door behind me. The morgue was well lit and cold, a long room with several stainless steel compartments and 2 large refrigerators. I felt better there. Safe. Until I looked at the observation window across the room and saw someone standing just beyond it. Not someone, really. A shape. It looked like a man, but all wrong. Too tall, thin, like stretched wax. I could only see the silhouette. It didn't move, just stood there. I blinked. It was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I tagged the body, slid it into the cooler, logged the paperwork, and left as fast as I could. As I pushed the now empty gurney back into the hallway, I noticed something on the floor. A small trail of wet footprints, bare feet. They led from the morgue door toward the old psych unit. I didn't follow them. I just ran. When I got back upstairs, I told one of the other transporters what had happened. His name was Donnie, a guy who'd worked there for almost 15 years. He didn't even look surprised. Just sighed and nodded slowly. "You saw him. he said. "The tall man." I asked him what he meant. Donnie said back when the South Wing was still the psych unit, there was a patient, a tall, schizophrenic man who had killed his roommate with a spoon, if you can believe it. The staff said he used to whisper to himself all night, talking to someone who wasn't there. Claimed a shadow followed him, a shadow with no face. They found him one morning with his head smashed into the corner of his cell. Looked like he'd done it himself, over and over again. His blood had soaked into the tile. They shut down the unit the year after that. Donnie said people see things down there all the time. Shapes, footsteps, whispers, the tall man. He said if I ever heard him again, not to look back. Looking at him makes it worse, he warned. I tried to avoid that hallway after that, but it wasn't always possible. Some nights, the other elevators would be out or backed up, and each time I had to go down there, I'd get that same feeling in my gut, like something was waiting, watching. Once, I was in the stairwell beside the south corridor when I saw a figure standing 3 floors below me. The same tall, lanky outline. I blinked and it was gone. Another time, I got a call to pick up a body, and when I arrived in the morgue, the cooler was already open. The toe tag was ripped off. The sheet was gone. I thought someone else had done the transfer early, but when I checked the logs, no one else had been scheduled. That body was never found. After 6 months, I transferred to the main hospital in Columbus. Couldn't take it anymore. Even now, I still dream about that hallway sometimes. Always the same dream. I'm pushing a gurney, the lights are buzzing, and I can hear the whisper again. He's not alone. I wake up sweating every time. I talked to a nurse I knew from that hospital a few months ago. She said the South Wing's finally being demolished, but the workers keep quitting. Said their equipment stops working. One guy said he saw someone standing in the rubble, but when he shouted at them, they vanished into the snow. The hospital says it's just old building problems. I know better. Story the end. I started working night shifts at the Cloverleaf Rest Home in early 2018, a few months after moving to Southern Ohio. It was one of those jobs you take when you're desperate and can't afford to be picky. I was 24, broke, and unfamiliar with the area, and the only opening I could find was for a night nurse assistant at this half-forgotten long-term care facility tucked behind a decaying strip mall. It was old, built in the 1940s, and the wings were laid out in a horseshoe shape, with dimly lit corridors and walls that carried every creak and groan like whispers down a hallway. The place had that distinct smell every nursing home seems to have, a mix of antiseptic, stale air, and something underneath you try not to think about too hard. On my first night, my supervisor, Janet, walked me through the halls, showing me the residents I'd be checking on. Most were either sleeping or completely out of it due to medication, but a few sat quietly in their rooms, watching television or just staring into the darkness. The night shift crew was small, just me, Janet, and an older security guard named Lou, who patrolled the grounds and occasionally helped us with agitated patients. "Room 12, Janet said as we passed the West Wing. "Don't go in unless the call light is on. That room stays locked." "Why?" I asked. She gave me a quick look and said, "It's just protocol. Empty room, storage mostly. Used to be part of hospice care, but we don't use it now." She moved on like she didn't want to talk about it. Over the next few weeks, I started settling into the rhythm of the job. The night shift was quiet. We took rounds every hour or so, checking vitals, repositioning bedridden residents, and helping anyone who pressed their call button. A lot of the time, it was just about keeping the place from falling apart in the dark. Janet mostly stayed at the nurses' station, flipping through files or watching late-night sitcom reruns on the tiny break room TV. But something felt off at night. It wasn't one big thing, more like a series of little ones that started adding up. Doors that I knew were shut would be cracked open when I passed by again. The call lights on empty rooms would blink for a few seconds and then stop. Cold spots would move through the hallways like air conditioning drafts, but there weren't any vents nearby. Sometimes, when I was near room 12, I'd get this creeping sensation like someone was standing behind me, close enough to touch. But when I turned around, there'd be nothing. Once, during my 3rd week, I heard the faint sound of someone crying as I walked down the East Wing hallway. At first, I thought it was one of the residents. Crying isn't unusual in a place like that. People are lonely, scared, disoriented. But when I followed the sound, it led me straight to room 12. The door was locked and the lights inside were off. I knocked, out of instinct. The crying stopped immediately. Just silence. Janet had said not to go in, but I had the master key. I remember pausing, listening. Then I unlocked it and opened the door slowly. The room was empty. Just a bed pushed against the wall, no mattress, an old dresser, and a covered mirror. Dust hung in the air like smoke in the flashlight beam from my phone. There was nothing in there. No one. I closed the door and locked it again. When I got back to the nurse's station, Janet looked up from her clipboard. "You didn't go into 12, did you?" I didn't answer. She sighed, stood up, and said, "Let's take a walk." We walked outside under the dull, flickering parking lot light, and she lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "Room 12 used to belong to a woman named Clara Hayes. She was put into hospice here in 2004. Mid-60s, late-stage liver cancer, and no family left. They say she never had visitors, never got mail, nothing. Just stared at the walls, night after night, whispering to herself." I asked her what she meant by whispering. Janet just looked at me with tired eyes. She used to say she saw a man standing in her mirror. "Neth," she said, "tall, wearing a black coat, no face. Claimed he talked to her at night. Nurses thought it was the medication or dementia, but after a while, even they started hearing things. Lights going off, TVs turning on in empty rooms. One night, a nurse named Dolores went in to check on her and came out sobbing, quit the next day." I asked what happened to Clara. "She died in that bed," Janet said, flicking ash onto the pavement. Heart stopped around 2:13 a.m. No struggle, no signs of distress. Just stopped. When they moved her body, the mirror had fogged up from the inside, like someone had been breathing on it. She dropped her cigarette and stomped it out. I don't know what's real anymore, but I know the room's locked for a reason. The next night, I found myself staring down the hallway toward room 12. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Ghost stories and old buildings made for a dangerous mix, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I began noticing that some residents avoided that end of the wing altogether. One woman, Ruthie, who barely remembered her own name most days, would shuffle to the nurse's station and whisper, "He's watching again." "He?" I asked one night. "The one in the mirror." I swear my blood ran cold. On May 11th, I came in for my shift and saw that the facility was down 2 staff members due to a flu outbreak. It was just me and Janet that night. Lou was out. We were barely keeping up. Around 2:10 a.m., I passed room 12 on my way back from changing a resident's bedding. I paused. The door was cracked open. I stared at it. I knew it had been locked. I always checked during rounds. No one should have had the key. I hesitated, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The mirror was uncovered. It hung above the dresser, and I could see my reflection in it. Shaky, pale, eyes wide. Then, for a split second, it wasn't just me. Something stood behind me in the mirror. It wasn't visible in the room itself, only in the glass. Tall, wearing black, faceless. Just darkness where the face should have been. I spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. I backed out quickly, heart pounding, and shut the door. Janet was gone when I got back to the station. I searched the building, found her sitting in the storage closet, hugging her knees, tears running down her face. "I saw him," she whispered. "He's back." The next week, more things happened. Residents started complaining about someone standing in their rooms at night. The security guard on duty, someone new named Reggie, quit after only 3 shifts. He told me on his way out that he saw someone walking through the hallway who disappeared into the wall. I should have left then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself that maybe it was all in my head, that working long nights in a place filled with sickness and death was just warping my perspective. Then came June 2nd. The power went out around 2:05 a.m. The generator kicked in a few seconds later, but all the hallway lights stayed off. Just emergency backup strips along the floor. Everything was silent. The call light for room 12 lit up. That room wasn't on the generator system. It shouldn't have had power. I radioed Janet, no answer. Against everything in me, I walked down the hall. Every step felt heavier. The air felt thick, humid, like breathing through a wet rag. When I got to the door, it was wide open. The room glowed with a faint blue light, not from any bulb, just ambient, unnatural, like moonlight underwater. I stepped in. In the mirror, I saw Clara. Her hospital gown hung from her like rags, her skin sagged and gray. Her mouth opened in the reflection, but no sound came out. Then she raised her hand and pointed directly at me. Behind her, the tall man appeared again. This time, he didn't stay in the mirror. I turned to run, but he was standing in the room. His coat brushed the floor, and the space where his face should have been was just writhing blackness. I stumbled backward and fell. The last thing I saw before I hit the ground was his hand reaching toward my face. I woke up 2 hours later in the break room. Janet was slapping my cheek, screaming my name. She said she found me unconscious outside the West Wing. No idea how I'd gotten there. Room 12 was locked again. The facility closed that September for renovations, but the real reason was that 3 residents and 2 staff had died unexpectedly over the summer. No causes found. Just stopped breathing in their sleep. The owners didn't want an investigation. I don't work nights anymore, and I never look in uncovered mirrors after dark. Story the end. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour gas station in northern Michigan, about 10 miles from the nearest town and right off a mostly empty stretch of highway. It was the kind of place that got just enough traffic to stay open through the night, but not nearly enough to justify 2 people working. So I worked alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. It wasn't glamorous, but I needed the job. I was 23 and had dropped out of college the year before. The pay was bad, the coffee was worse, and the gas station had a weird, isolated feel even during the day. It was one of those small-town gas stations that hadn't been updated since the 90s. A single flickering fluorescent light out front, 2 old fuel pumps, and a tiny store inside that sold basic snacks, drinks, lottery tickets, and cheap beer. The back wall had a row of fridges that buzzed loud enough to drown out your thoughts. There was a little office in the back where I could take breaks, eat lunch, or just sit and listen to the radio. For the first couple of months, the nights were mostly boring. Some truckers came through for gas and cigarettes, a few locals buying beer before midnight. Sometimes nobody came in between midnight and 4. I'd sweep the floor, restock shelves, drink terrible coffee, and scroll through my phone. That was until things started happening. The first time I noticed something strange, it was a little after 3 a.m. on a Thursday. I was doing inventory in the back room, the part where we stored overstock for chips, soda, and cartons of cigarettes. The door that led to the back room had a little bell attached to it. It would jingle whenever someone opened it from the store. That night, the bell jingled like someone came in. I figured a customer had wandered in and went back out to the front. I walked back out, and no one was there. The door hadn't chimed. I checked the lot outside. No cars, no trucks, not even a breeze. It was dead silent. The aisles were untouched, the front door locked as it always was after midnight for safety, only opened manually from inside when someone buzzed. The odd part? The coffee machine had just started brewing. Now, I never set the coffee maker on a timer. It didn't even have one. I was the only one who ever brewed coffee at night, and I sure as hell hadn't started a new pot. But it was working, just like someone had pushed the button. The pot filled slowly, the smell bitter and stale. I turned it off, dumped the pot, and tried not to think too much about it. A week later, the motion sensors on the security system started acting up. I'd be in the back office, watching the monitor and the camera facing the snack aisle would flicker and show movement. I'd look up, expecting to see someone, but again, no one was there. It wasn't a glitch either. It only happened between 2 and 4 a.m. and always in the same spot, right in front of the chip rack where we stocked the Doritos and pretzels. A couple of times I thought I saw something tall in the corner of the frame, just for a second. But when I rewound the footage, nothing showed, like whatever moved wasn't being recorded. One night, I decided to stand in the aisle after the cameras picked up motion. I just stood there in silence, waiting. I had turned off the radio. Even the humming from the fridges in back couldn't hide how still everything felt. That's when the door to the freezer aisle clicked open. It opened slow, like someone was pulling it, and then slammed shut. Loud. Violent. I walked over and yanked the door open myself, half expecting a raccoon or something, but there was nothing. Not a thing out of place. The glass fogged over like someone had breathed on it. After that, I started leaving the lights fully on, even in the aisles. It made the electric bill go up, and the owner complained when he noticed it, but I said it was for safety reasons. I didn't care. I didn't want to be in the dark in that place again. Things escalated in October. You know me, I remember the exact date, October 14th, because it was the same night the power went out during my shift. A bad storm had rolled through during the evening, and by midnight, winds were over 40 miles an hour. The power flickered around 2:30 a.m. and then went completely out at 2:42. I checked my watch when it happened. I remember because I had just stepped outside for a cigarette, and then the lights inside went dead all at once. No backup generator, no emergency lighting, nothing. I stayed calm, walked back in, grabbed my flashlight from under the register, and sat down to wait it out. But something didn't feel right. You know how when a place loses power, there's usually still noise, like the wind outside or the creaks in the building or the occasional car? This time, it felt like everything went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that hurts your ears, like pressure building. I sat in that chair behind the counter, trying not to freak out, and that's when I heard the jingling. The little bell on the backroom door. I stood up and called out, "Hello?" No answer. Just the bell again. One soft jingle, then nothing. I turned toward the back and shined the flashlight. The door was open, just a crack. I was positive I had closed it earlier. I took a deep breath and walked to it slowly. Inside, the shelves were as I left them. But in the corner, where we kept the mop bucket and cleaning supplies, I saw a trail of wet footprints leading toward the freezer. Bare feet, no shoes, no socks, just long, pale, human-looking footprints soaked into the concrete floor. The air grew ice cold. My breath fogged up. And somewhere in the darkness, behind the shelves, I heard the sound of someone whispering my name. Not yelling, not calling out, just whispering. "Brian." I spun around, pointed the flashlight everywhere, but there was no one. Just a low hum now, almost like the building itself was vibrating. The lights came back on at 2:58 a.m. Everything flickered violently before stabilizing. I ran to the front, locked the door, and called the store manager. When he answered, half asleep, I told him I needed the rest of the night off. I didn't even wait for a reply. I just left. I went back the next night, and for a while things were quiet. But I started noticing small changes, items being moved on shelves, radios turning on without anyone touching them. Customers started mentioning things too, especially one regular named Carl, a trucker who stopped in twice a week. "You ever see someone hanging around out back?" he asked one night around 1:30 a.m. "Out back?" "Yeah, tall guy, no coat, even when it's cold, just stands there facing the woods." I told him no, but something about the way he said it chilled me. Another woman, a lady who came in for lottery tickets, asked if we'd hired someone new. Saw a man walk right past the window when I pulled up, but when I came inside, no one was there. Thought maybe someone new was working with you. It kept happening. People seeing someone. Just a glimpse. Just outside their view. Always tall. Always silent. One night, maybe 3 weeks before I quit, the worst night of all happened. It was 3:12 a.m., and I was in the back office watching the monitors. The motion sensor lit up in the snack aisle again. I looked at the screen and saw it clear as day. There was a man standing in the middle of the aisle. Tall, gaunt, face obscured by shadow. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the security camera directly. I froze, stared. My hand hovered over the walkie I never used. Then he moved. He didn't walk. He glided, like his feet weren't touching the ground, right toward the register. I left the office and walked into the main store. It was empty. No one at the register. No sound. I was standing exactly where I saw him on the monitor, but nothing was there. Then the cold hit me. It was like the air got sucked out of the building. I could see my breath. My eyes stung like I'd walked into a freezer, and from behind the counter I heard breathing. Not mine. It was heavy, wet, labored. I crept toward the counter and crouched down. There was someone there, kneeling on the floor. His skin was grayish like ash. His mouth was open, gasping like he'd been drowning. His eyes were locked on me, sunken, dead. I screamed. I didn't even try to be brave. I ran straight out the door, left it open, and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the highway. I called the manager from my cell and told them I quit. I never went back. They mailed me my last paycheck. I've heard they still have trouble keeping night shift workers there. Most quit after a few weeks. No one talks about it, but locals know something's wrong. They say that stretch of land used to be a burial ground, or that a hitchhiker was killed near there and never found. Whatever the truth is, I don't care. I'll never go near that place again. Even now, over a year later, I still dream about the man behind the counter. I still wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m., and sometimes, just sometimes, I wake up to find wet footprints leading from my bedroom door to the edge of my bed. Story the end. I took a night security job back in 2019 at a large, outdated paper mill in a small town in northern Georgia. The mill had been around since the early 1900s, and while it had gone through several renovations over the years, most of the original structure was still intact. Worn brick buildings, steel catwalks, massive boilers, and machinery that hadn't been replaced in decades. It was quiet at night, eerie even, but I didn't mind. The pay was good, and I preferred working alone. The property was vast, stretching over several acres with multiple warehouses, storage units, and production areas. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and my duties were pretty straightforward. Patrol the grounds, check in at various stations using a handheld scanner, and monitor the camera feeds from the small office near the main gate. I worked entirely alone, no supervisors, no coworkers, just me, the dark and the low hum of machinery that never really turned off. The first few nights were uneventful, boring, even. I walked my rounds every hour, flashlight in hand, and used my downtime to read or watch videos on my phone in the office. The only real noise came from the wind whistling through cracked windows or the occasional clunk of old pipes. But by the end of my first week, I began noticing things. Small things at first that I couldn't explain. The first incident happened in Building 3, one of the oldest sections of the mill. It was used mainly for storage now, filled with broken pallets, outdated equipment, and stacked rolls of paper. I had just scanned the checkpoint inside the building and was heading back toward the door when I heard something heavy scrape across the concrete floor behind me. I turned around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. There was nothing there. The room was filled with clutter and shadows, but everything looked exactly as it had when I entered. Still, the sound had been clear and distinct, like metal dragging across the floor. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing. Just silence. I left the building, chalking it up to a rat knocking something over, and didn't think much of it until the following night. I had just started my patrol around 10:30 p.m. when I walked past Building 3 and noticed the overhead light inside was on. That struck me as odd because I always made sure to turn off the lights after each check. Assuming I'd forgotten, I unlocked the door and stepped inside to shut it off. The switch was already down, yet the light was on. I flipped the switch a few times. Nothing happened. It just stayed lit. That building was wired through one of the older panels, and I figured it was just a malfunction. So I finished my round and made a note to tell the maintenance crew in the morning. Around 2 a.m., I returned for the second patrol. The light was off. No one else had access to the building overnight, just me, and I hadn't touched it since earlier. This time, I didn't go inside. I just stood at the door for a minute, flashlight ready, listening. That same dragging sound came again, low and long, like something being pulled across the concrete. I pulled the door open quickly and scanned the inside with my light. Empty. That time I did feel it. Something not right. The air was too still, too heavy. I got out fast and didn't go back in until the next shift. Over the next week, things escalated. The lights in Building 3 would flicker when I passed by. I started hearing soft footsteps on the upper catwalk in Building 2 during my patrols, even though no one used that walkway anymore. One night, just after 3 a.m., I was in the office scrolling through the cameras when I noticed a figure moving through the hallway between Buildings 1 and 2. It was blurry, hard to make out, but it looked like a man, tall, dressed in old work clothes, walking with a limp. I switched cameras to follow him, but by the time the next feed loaded, he was gone. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed toward that hallway. No one was there, and there was no exit nearby. It was a dead-end corridor with locked doors on both sides. I was beginning to lose sleep. I'd get home after my shift exhausted but unable to relax. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. I even started leaving a light on in the living room just to feel less alone. I told myself it was the stress of the night shift messing with my head. Isolation, sleep deprivation, it can do weird things. But then one night, something happened that I still can't explain, no matter how much I try to rationalize it. It was just after 4 a.m., and I had finished my third patrol. I returned to the office and sat down to review the camera feeds. I had started recording clips using the DVR feature, hoping to catch something I could actually show someone. I clicked on the feed from Building 3, just static. The entire camera system had gone black for that building. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out. The air was colder than usual, and everything was dead quiet, like the whole world had stopped moving. As I neared Building 3, I noticed the door was ajar. I never left it that way. I always double-checked the locks. I hesitated, then pushed the door open slowly. My flashlight beam swept across the floor. Stacks of pallets, rusted machines, a torn tarp flapping in a cold draft. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, a figure, pale, standing completely still. I couldn't make out the face, but it was humanoid. Not quite a man, not quite a woman, just a form. As soon as the beam hit it, the figure moved, fast, too fast, and disappeared behind a pile of boxes. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stood there, heart pounding, arm frozen midair, flashlight trembling. I forced myself to back out of the building slowly, not daring to turn my back. As I stepped into the open air, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I ran back to the office. For the next 2 hours, I sat there with every light on, holding the flashlight like a weapon, jumping at every creak and rustle from outside. The camera feed never came back on. When my relief showed up at 6 a.m., I didn't say a word. I just clocked out and left. That morning, I called in sick and stayed home. I slept with a baseball bat next to the bed. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that I was overtired, overworked, and that maybe it had been a trick of the light or a shadow. But deep down, I knew that whatever I saw was real. Too real. When I returned 2 nights later, I found a note on the desk in the security office. It was from the day supervisor. Let me know if you notice anything strange with the lights in Building 3. Maintenance checked it out, said the wiring's fine. Camera feed was working when we left at 5. I checked the feed. It was working again. I rewound the footage to the time I'd seen the figure. Nothing. Just a static image, then darkness, then the camera flickering back on at 5 a.m. I never told anyone what I saw. But that wasn't the end of it. Every few nights, the same things would happen. Lights turning on and off, footsteps on empty catwalks, shadows that moved where there was nothing to cast them. And always, always, that cold feeling when I passed Building 3, like walking into a freezer. I started wearing a small crucifix under my shirt. I wasn't religious, but it made me feel better. I stopped going into Building 3 unless absolutely necessary. I rerouted my patrols and checked it only from the outside. A few weeks later, a new guard was hired to work the opposite rotation. Frank, a guy in his 50s, retired cop. One night when our shifts briefly overlapped, he asked, "You ever get weird feelings in that old building?" I didn't answer right away, just looked at him. He continued, "Building 3. It's got something in there. I swear I saw someone walking across the upper platform 2 nights ago, but when I got inside, there was no one. Place was locked up. Thought I was losing it." We shared stories then, bits and pieces, enough to know we weren't alone. The mill still operates today, but I don't work there anymore. I lasted another 3 months before transferring to a day position at a different site. Frank stuck it out longer, but eventually left too. Said he couldn't sleep anymore. Said he started seeing the pale figure outside his own house. I don't know what haunts that place. Maybe it's someone who died there back when safety wasn't a concern. Maybe it's something older, tied to the land. Or maybe places just remember things, pain, fear, anger, and that memory never fully fades. Whatever it is, it's still there, waiting in the quiet, watching from the shadows. And if you ever find yourself working alone on the night shift, remember, some doors are better left unopened. Story the end. I took the night shift job at a gas station just off I-70 in Kansas because it was quiet, paid decently for what it was, and allowed me time to focus on schoolwork. I was working toward an online degree in criminal justice and thought the graveyard shift would be the least stressful way to get some hours in and make ends meet. The station sat between two small towns, nowhere big enough to justify being open all night, but we were the only place for miles where truckers and lost drivers could stop, fill up, and maybe grab some coffee or chips. The building was small, just two gas pumps out front, a narrow store with a few aisles of snacks, cigarettes, soft drinks, and cheap roadside trinkets, and a storage room in the back that doubled as a break area. We also had a single bathroom, which customers could only access if they asked for the key attached to a giant plastic spoon. That place had seen better days, for sure. Flickering fluorescence, weird drafts, and a faint musty smell that no amount of lemon-scented air freshener could cover. But I didn't mind. Most nights were uneventful, until they weren't. It started around my third week there. I remember the night clearly because it was the first time I felt truly uneasy in that place. It was just after 2 a.m. on a Monday. I'd had one customer the entire shift, a tired-looking guy hauling a cattle trailer westbound. After he left, I was sitting behind the register, flipping through my textbooks. The place was dead silent, no wind, no cars, just the soft hum of the soda fridge. Then I heard it. A knock at the window. It was faint, just one knock. I looked up, expecting to see someone at the door, maybe a late-night traveler. But no one was there. The pumps were empty. I stood up and walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. The air was heavy, humid, still. I scanned the lot, saw nothing, and went back in. Maybe a bird, maybe I imagined it. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I spun around and saw the shadow of a figure outside the glass, just on the edge of the light spilling from the awning over the pumps. The shapes stood still, tall, thin. I blinked, and it was gone. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, but told myself it had to be a trick of the eye. I even walked outside again, circled the building with my phone's flashlight, but saw no one. I locked the door after that and went back to the register. Just after 3 a.m., the store lights flickered. All of them. In sync. I figured it was the old wiring. Happened once or twice before when the AC kicked in. But this time the lights didn't just flicker. They dimmed for a few seconds, long enough to leave me in a kind of half-darkness, before popping back on. I tried to shake it off and went into the back to make some coffee. I had just finished pouring myself a cup when I heard the door chime ding, like someone had just walked in. That shouldn't have been possible. I locked the door earlier, I was certain of it. I grabbed the baseball bat we kept behind the counter and stepped back into the store. There was no one. No footsteps, no voices, but the air felt different, charged, like when you stand under power lines and the hairs on your arms rise. Then I saw something that made me stop cold. One of the coolers, the one for bottled water, had its door wide open. I hadn't restocked it, I hadn't touched it, and it was always shut tightly. I walked over slowly, heart thudding. I pushed the door shut, stepped back, and watched. A second later, it opened again, right in front of me. That was the first night I seriously considered quitting. But I didn't. I needed the money. The next night, I told my boss, Doug, about it. He was a grizzled guy in his 60s, ex-Marine, not one for stories or nonsense. He just looked at me and said, "Oh, that again." I asked him what he meant. He gave me a long look and then, without breaking eye contact, told me that something bad had happened at the station years ago, something no one liked talking about. Back in the early 90s, a man named Travis used to work the night shift. Same as me. One night, someone came in, robbed the place, and shot Travis dead behind the counter. They never caught the guy. Travis was only 24, a college student, just like me. After that, weird things started happening, mostly on the night shift. The story was that sometimes employees would hear knocking or see someone standing outside the glass, but when they looked, no one was there. The doors would unlock by themselves. Items moved. Sometimes music from the jukebox in the corner would play without being plugged in. Most employees didn't last more than a few months. I laughed nervously, thinking he was messing with me. But Doug didn't laugh. He just handed me an extra set of keys and said, "If the lights go out completely, don't go into the bathroom. Just don't." That night, I kept my phone fully charged, stayed near the counter, and avoided the bathroom like the plague. Around 2:45 a.m., I was counting change in the register drawer when I noticed the security monitor above me was flickering. We had 4 cameras, 2 outside, 2 inside. One pointed directly at the front counter, the other toward the aisles. The inside camera feed was normal. The outside cameras, however, showed something strange. There was movement at pump 1. I looked up at the live feed and saw a figure, thin, dark clothing, motionless, standing next to the pump. But when I looked out the window, no one. I looked back up. The figure was still there on the monitor. That's when the feed glitched, just for a second. When it came back, the figure was standing closer, right up against the glass. Again, I looked out the window. Nothing. I stared back at the screen. Gone. The door chime dinged. I nearly dropped the drawer. There was no one inside. No one had opened the door. But the chime went off again, and then again. Ding, ding, ding. It sounded like someone was walking in, then out, then in again. The lights above me flickered once more and then went completely dark. Only the glow from the soda fridge remained. I held my breath and listened. Silence. Then a low hum. It was coming from the bathroom. The light under the door was on. I hadn't turned it on. I stood there, frozen, and then I heard something that made my stomach drop, a man crying. It was muffled but unmistakable. It was coming from the bathroom, sobbing, broken, hollow. I took one slow step toward the door, the bat in my hand slick with sweat. I called out, "Hello?" The sobbing stopped. Complete silence. Then from the other side of the door, "Help me." A man's voice, weak, desperate. I backed away. I remembered what Doug said. "Don't go into the bathroom." I grabbed my phone and called him. No answer. The voice called out again. "Help me, please." I couldn't move. I just stood there until the sun started rising around 5:30 a.m. As the light trickled through the windows, the bathroom light shut off by itself. I waited until 6, then unlocked the doors and walked outside into the morning. Doug came in around 7 and asked me if I was okay. I told him everything. He just nodded and said, "You should probably find another job." I didn't go back the next night. I called in and quit over the phone. I didn't need the paycheck that bad. A few weeks later, I passed the gas station while driving to visit my parents. There was yellow tape around the entrance and a few sheriff's cruisers parked out front. I pulled over and asked a bystander what happened. Apparently, the new night shift guy, just a teenager, had gone missing. His car was still in the lot. All the lights were off, the cameras dead, no signs of forced entry. They found the bathroom door locked from the inside, but no one was in there. No prints, no blood, just the smell of gasoline and something else like burnt hair. They never found the kid. To this day, I won't drive that stretch of highway at night, and I never, ever stop at remote gas stations after dark. Some places are just wrong. Not haunted in the Hollywood sense, but scarred, damaged. Something clings to them, something that wants you to see it, acknowledge it, hear it knocking at the glass. And if you do, you might not make it out. Story the end. The night shift at the hospital was a world unlike any other. While the days were filled with bustling corridors, busy nurses, and the constant hum of conversations, the nights felt different, like stepping into a separate dimension where the walls held secrets and shadows, whispered stories that daylight dared not reveal. I worked the overnight shift as a respiratory therapist in a mid-sized hospital in Ohio. It was a job I took out of necessity more than passion. Steady pay, decent hours, and a chance to keep my mind busy while the rest of the world slept. The hospital itself was old, built in the early 1900s but remodeled piecemeal over the decades. Some parts gleamed with modern equipment and shiny tiles, while others still had faded linoleum floors, peeling paint, and long, dim hallways lined with patient rooms that seemed frozen in time. The East Wing, where I spent most nights, was one of the oldest sections, barely updated, with heavy wooden doors, brass knobs, and a peculiar coldness in the air that didn't come from the AC. The night shift crew was small, a handful of nurses, a couple of respiratory techs like me, janitorial staff, and sometimes an on-call doctor who rarely showed up unless there was a code or an emergency. I was usually by myself, floating from room to room, checking ventilators, adjusting oxygen levels, and responding to alarms that pierced the silence like gunshots. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had. But the hospital had its own way of shaking your faith. It started on a quiet Tuesday night, about 2 months after I'd been working there. The night was cool, the kind of early fall chill that seeps in under the doors and makes your breath visible in the dimly lit corridors. I was finishing up a routine check in the ICU when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. It was coming from down the hall near room 215. Room 215 was unoccupied at the time. It was a private room, one of the nicer ones with a window overlooking the hospital's courtyard. I'd passed it dozens of times before without anything unusual. I thought maybe a loose window shutter was rattling in the breeze, so I walked over to check. The tapping stopped as soon as I got close. I shined my flashlight into the room. Empty. The bed was neatly made, the monitors silent, nothing out of place. I frowned and moved on. That night, I noticed the tapping again. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just after midnight. It was subtle, almost rhythmic. It wasn't loud enough to be heard beyond a few feet, but I could swear I heard it every time I walked by that corridor. One night, during my break, I sat in the small staff lounge near the nurses' station, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone when I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't near room 215, but from the other side of the hall, room 217. I got up and walked quietly down the hallway. When I reached the door of room 217, the tapping stopped abruptly. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. I tried the handle. Locked. I shrugged and went back to the lounge, telling myself it was just an old building settling. But then things escalated. About a week later, a nurse named Sarah came to me, looking pale and jittery. She said she'd heard voices near the nurses' station, whispers, distant crying, and a chilling cold that made her skin crawl. She said she saw shadows moving just beyond her line of sight. I listened carefully but chalked it up to stress or lack of sleep. Night shift could mess with your head. One night, I was making rounds near the surgical ward, passing by room 310. The door was cracked open, and I noticed a flicker of movement inside. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. I stepped closer, and suddenly the door slammed shut with a force that made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled out my radio and called the front desk. "Did anyone just close the door to room 310? I asked. Static. No response. I tried the handle. Locked tight. I backed away, uneasy. Later that week, the hospital reported several unexplained power surges during the night, all traced back to the East Wing. The old wiring was supposed to have been replaced years ago, but clearly something was causing intermittent failures. The maintenance team blamed faulty equipment, but some of us whispered about other possibilities. One particularly cold night, around 3 a.m., I was called to assist with a patient in the emergency room. The ER was on the first floor, away from the East Wing, so I felt relieved to leave that creepy hallway behind for a while. The patient was an elderly man brought in after a fall. The attendants tended to him. I noticed the flickering lights overhead and the shadows they cast on the walls. I caught a glimpse of a figure standing just outside the sliding glass doors of the ER. An indistinct shape, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. Later, the security cameras recorded a flash of static in that exact spot, but nothing else. My nights began to feel heavier. The tapping, the whispers, the cold spots in hallways where no ventilation was supposed to reach. Objects I'd left on countertops would be moved, sometimes slightly, sometimes drastically. Staff reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors. One nurse claimed she saw a pale woman in a hospital gown staring out the window of room 215, only for the woman to vanish when she tried to approach. It wasn't long before I started to experience it myself. One night, during the graveyard shift, I was alone in the respiratory therapy office, updating patient charts on the computer. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Suddenly, the room temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me. A quiet sobbing started somewhere behind the walls, soft at first, then growing louder, desperate. I looked up, heart racing, but the office was empty. No one around. The sobbing shifted into low whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was mournful, pleading. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the hallway. The sobbing stopped. I checked the nearby rooms, empty. I told myself it was my imagination, exhaustion messing with my mind. But then, a week later, I was in the break room, and the lights flickered. The door creaked open slowly on its own. I froze. A shadow moved past the doorway, but when I turned, no one was there. That was the night I realized I wasn't just imagining things. One of the patients on the night shift, an older man named Mr. Green, had been in a coma for weeks. He'd been brought in after a stroke and had no family. On several occasions, staff reported that he murmured words they couldn't understand, sometimes seemed to be looking at something unseen. Late one night, I was adjusting his oxygen mask when his eyes suddenly snapped open. They were wide, terrified, staring into the corner of the room. He whispered hoarsely, "They're coming." Then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again. After that, stories spread among the night staff about the haunted ward. Some said the hospital was built over a former burial ground. Others claimed the land had been the site of a tragic fire decades ago that killed patients and staff alike. I researched the hospital's history one night during my break. Turns out the building was once a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients in the 1920s. Many died there, isolated and suffering. Some were buried in unmarked graves nearby. The stories matched the feelings we were experiencing. One night, I was called to the East Wing after a nurse reported hearing screams in room 215. When I arrived, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, and the window was open despite the chilly night. The temperature was freezing. I closed the window and tried to calm myself when the lights flickered violently, then went out. The emergency backup lights cast eerie red glows. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. The whispers started again, surrounding me. I struggled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the corner of the room, a shadowy figure emerged, a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her face pale and eyes hollow. I froze in terror. She mouthed words I couldn't hear. I managed to scream and pound on the door. Moments later, the lights flickered back on, and the door swung open. I ran out, breathless. I quit my job the next day. I never returned to that hospital. But sometimes, when the night is still and silent, I hear the tapping in my own home, faint and rhythmic, calling me back to those cold hallways and the souls trapped within. Story, the end. Working the night shift at the county hospital in rural Indiana wasn't something I'd planned on. But after moving back home following a rough breakup, I needed steady work and hours that fit my schedule. The job was for a security officer position, overnight hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., mostly monitoring cameras, doing rounds, and making sure no unauthorized folks wandered the hallways. The hospital was old, built in the 1920s and expanded over the decades, but some wings still had that aged, creaky feel. Even the janitorial staff talked about strange noises in certain sections, but nobody ever put much stock in those stories. I figured it was just the building settling or people's imaginations. My first few weeks went smoothly enough, the nights long but quiet. The patients were mostly confined to their rooms, and visitors were almost non-existent at those hours. The hospital had a special wing, an older part of the building no longer used for patient care, that housed administrative offices and storage rooms. My patrol route took me through that section several times an hour. It was dark, musty, and the fluorescent lights flickered unpredictably, making shadows leap across the cracked linoleum floor. One night, just after midnight, I heard a faint sound coming from the old wing. It was a rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty hallway. I stopped and turned my flashlight toward the far end, but no one was there. I checked the adjacent rooms, doors locked tight, no sign of anyone inside. I shrugged it off and continued my patrol. A couple nights later, the tapping returned, this time accompanied by what sounded like whispering. I swear, it was like someone was trying to communicate but couldn't form words. The hairs on my neck stood up. I grabbed my radio to call the front desk, but no one answered. I made my way cautiously down the hall. The lights flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw a shadow dart just out of my flashlight's beam. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the darkness. No reply. On my third week, I was assigned to a different section, the basement. The hospital's basement was a maze of old pipes, electrical panels, and unused storage rooms. The air was damp and smelled like rust and mildew. Most staff avoided it unless necessary. While checking the fire doors one night, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking, but the hall was empty. Then, through the echo, I thought I caught the faint sound of a woman humming. The melody was haunting, something out of a lullaby. I told myself it was the building settling or an overactive imagination, but the feeling didn't leave me. One night, around 3:30 a.m., I was monitoring the security feeds when the camera in the old wing went black. I tried rebooting the system, but the feed wouldn't come back. When I got to the hallway, the lights were out as well. I flicked on my flashlight and started walking down, heart pounding. Suddenly, I saw a figure at the far end, an old woman wearing a faded nightgown, her hair in loose curls, face obscured by shadow. She stood perfectly still. I blinked, and she was gone. My hands were trembling as I radioed for backup. When maintenance arrived 20 minutes later, they found nothing wrong with the cameras or lights. The old woman wasn't anywhere to be found. The hospital staff later told me the story of Eleanor Watkins, a patient who died in that wing decades ago after suffering a long illness. They said she was often seen wandering the halls at night, looking for someone, something she lost. After that, I never walked the old wing alone. I started carrying a small cross my grandmother had given me, a talisman more for comfort than belief. The nights grew colder, the shadows deeper. One particularly cold December night, I was making my rounds near the old wing when the radio crackled. "Help me," a soft, desperate whisper echoed through the static. I dropped the radio, heart racing. The hallway was empty. I ran back to the security office, locking the door behind me. The camera feeds flickered violently and then went dark. I don't remember how I made it through the rest of that shift. When daylight finally came, I handed in my resignation. I never went back to Mercy General Hospital. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the tapping and the humming, and I wonder if Eleanor Watkins is still wandering those empty halls, waiting for someone to listen. Story, the end. The first night I started working the graveyard shift at the Springfield General Hospital, I thought it would be just like any other job. I was a newly hired janitor, assigned to clean and maintain the hospital after hours, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and the night shift meant I could keep my days free for school. The hospital itself was old, built in the early 1960s, with long, narrow corridors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of antiseptic that lingered even in the late hours. That first night, I was handed a large set of keys, a mop, cleaning supplies, and a floor plan. My supervisor, a woman named Janet, warned me to stick to the main hallways and avoid the east wing. When I asked why, she gave me a nervous smile and said, "Some areas here have had incidents, old stories. Best not to be alone over there, especially at night." I shrugged it off as superstition and focused on my work. As the weeks went by, I settled into the rhythm of my job. The hospital was usually quiet, except for the occasional nurse or night shift doctor making rounds. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant beep of a heart monitor or the soft rustle of hospital curtains. But one night in late October changed everything. I was finishing up cleaning the 4th floor near the east wing. The hall was dimly lit, with some of the bulbs flickering erratically. I remember the cold feeling in the air as I passed the door to room 417. The door was cracked open, and I heard faint whispers. Curious, I peeked inside. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair in the corner, gently swaying back and forth. No windows were open. The air was still. The whispers stopped as soon as I looked in, and the chair came to an abrupt stop. I blinked and shrugged it off as my imagination. I continued down the hallway, my footsteps echoing. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Not the slow, measured kind I was making, but quick, light steps, almost like someone was running. I stopped and turned around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I picked up my pace, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Turning a corner, I saw the janitor's closet door slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open, and it was on my cleaning route to check and clean that area. I approached it cautiously, and as I pushed the door open, a cold gust of air hit me, as if a door at the other end of the hallway had slammed shut. Inside the closet, nothing was out of place except an old, yellowed hospital badge on the floor, with a name I didn't recognize. Eleanor Davis. I pocketed the badge, thinking maybe it belonged to a former employee or patient. Later, during a break, I asked Janet about the name. Her face went pale. Eleanor Davis was a nurse who worked here in the 1960s. There was an accident. She died on the job. They say she still roams the East Wing. That night, after finishing my shift, I decided to walk the East Wing once more to check the rooms. As I passed room 421, I heard the faint sound of a lullaby. It was slow, melancholy, sung by a woman's voice. I froze. No one was supposed to be there. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the door to 421 creaked open. I could see the outline of a woman rocking in a chair, humming softly. Her face was blurry, like a shadow. I swallowed hard and stepped back. The door slammed shut behind me, and the hallway went completely dark. My heart was pounding, and I fumbled for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the hallway was empty. The rocking chair was gone. I rushed back to the main corridor and saw the janitor's badge again, lying in the center of the floor. I picked it up and ran out. After that night, I refused to work the East Wing. The strange noises, the footsteps, the chair rocking by itself, it was too much, but I still had to finish my shift. One night, while cleaning near the ER, I heard someone calling my name softly from the hall. I looked around but saw no one. Then I felt a hand lightly touch my shoulder. I spun around. No one. Later, I found a note taped to the mirror in the staff bathroom. It was written in faded ink, "Help me." I showed it to Janet, but she said the bathrooms were cleaned daily and no one else had access that night. She looked worried. That's when I realized I wasn't alone during the night shifts. One night, I was mopping the corridors near the basement when the power flickered and went out completely. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to guide me. I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the end of the hallway. It sounded like fingernails drumming on metal. As I moved closer, the tapping stopped. In the darkness, I saw the shape of a man standing near the maintenance door. He looked disheveled, wearing old hospital scrubs that were stained and torn. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I froze. He raised a hand and pointed down the hall, then vanished. I followed the direction and found a cracked wall panel. Behind it, a small box containing old photographs and letters from the hospital's early days. One letter stood out. It was from a nurse pleading for help, describing horrible conditions and abuse in the old psychiatric ward that had once been part of the hospital. I later learned that several patients had died under mysterious circumstances during that era, and some staff had tried to expose the conditions, but were silenced. The next day, I found out that the East Wing I had been avoiding was built on top of that old ward. From then on, I always carried the nurse's badge with me. One night, I heard soft footsteps behind me again, but this time I turned without fear. The shape of the woman, the nurse Eleanor Davis, was there, standing quietly. She smiled sadly and whispered, "Thank you." The hospital finally closed the East Wing a few months later, and the strange occurrences stopped. But sometimes, when I walk past old hospitals or hear faint humming late at night, I remember those nights and wonder how many lost souls still linger in the shadows, waiting to be heard. Story, the end. The hospital was a place where the night took on a different character. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the last visitors left, the building seemed to breathe in its own rhythm, quieter, slower, but also heavier, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of every soul that had ever passed through its halls. I worked the night shift in a hospital in the Midwest, a town so small it barely registered on a map. The hospital was old, built during the 1940s, with peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and a maze of corridors that always seemed to rearrange themselves just when you thought you knew the way. But I never thought much of it until that night. My name is Lisa. I'd been a nurse for 6 years, 3 of those working exclusively nights. The night shift at our hospital wasn't as busy as the day, but it was mentally exhausting. You had to be alert, especially because of the old building's quirks, the flickering lights, the creaks and groans, the sudden drafts in rooms that should have been sealed tight. I was working a typical 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. That night started out as uneventful as any other. The ER had a few patients, mostly minor injuries, some flu cases. I was finishing a report on a patient with a broken when I got a call to assist with a new admission. An elderly man found unconscious in his home. He was brought in around midnight, transported by ambulance from a nearby rural area. The paramedics said they found him slumped over in a chair, no signs of trauma, but unresponsive. They didn't know what had happened. No one lived with him. His neighbors hadn't seen him in days. I was assigned to monitor him in room 217, near the end of a long hallway. The room was old. The paint was chipped, that the window was cracked slightly, and there was a faint smell of antiseptic, mixed with something else, like damp wood or old fabric. I remember thinking the room felt colder than the rest of the ward. As I checked his vitals, the man stirred slightly but didn't wake. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins visible under the surface. His breathing was shallow. I called Dr. Matthews, the on-call physician, who ordered a full set of tests and to keep the patient under observation. Around 2 a.m., the hospital went quiet. Most of the patients were asleep or resting. The only sounds were the distant hum of machines and the occasional footsteps from the night staff. I decided to step out for a quick break. As I walked down the hallway toward the staff lounge, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered twice. I paused, looking up, then moved on. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I stopped and turned around. Nothing. I shrugged and chalked it up to my imagination. The hospital was old. Noises echoed. I went to the lounge, grabbed a cup of coffee, and checked my watch. 2:15 a.m. Returning to room 217, I found the patient still motionless. His monitors beeped steadily. No alarming signs yet. I sat down to chart notes when the lights flickered again, and longer this time. The overhead light dimmed and brightened, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. The emergency backup lights kicked in, casting an eerie red glow. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Reaching for my flashlight, I noticed something odd. The patient's eyes were open. Not fully, just the slightest crack, enough to see a dull gray iris staring straight ahead. "Sir?" I whispered, gently touching his hand. It was ice cold. No response. The radio at the nurse's station crackled suddenly with static and a faint voice. I thought I heard my name. I froze. "Lisa?" It whispered again, barely audible. I looked around the empty room, heart pounding. The old hospital had its share of weird noises, but this felt different. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the charge nurse, but the line was dead. The power flickered and then came back on, the fluorescent lights humming softly. I exhaled, telling myself to calm down. I checked the patient again. His eyes were closed this time. I was about to leave the room to get a nurse from the station when I heard it. The distinct sound of someone whispering right beside me. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight into the dark corners of the room. No one. The whispering continued, indistinct words floating in the stale air, too faint to understand, but unmistakably there. A sudden gust of cold air blew through the cracked window, making the curtain flutter despite the sealed room. I wrapped my arms around myself, telling myself it was just the wind. That's when I noticed a figure standing near the foot of the bed. A tall man in a black suit, his face obscured by shadows. I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself I was hallucinating, tired from too many long shifts. I left the room and walked briskly to the nurse's station. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. I tried to call for help, but the radios were still dead. The hospital's old wiring must have been acting up. I decided to check the maintenance room to report the power issues. The hallway to maintenance was dim, the emergency lights barely illuminating the cracked walls. I passed room 219, which had been empty for weeks. But then I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. They came from inside room 219. I hesitated. The door was closed. I knocked lightly. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I stepped back. The footsteps stopped. Then the door creaked open slowly, on its own. The room was pitch black inside. I shone my flashlight in. The only furniture was an old hospital bed, rusted and stained, and a small nightstand. No one was there. But then the lights flickered again, and on the far wall I saw writing, smeared with something dark like dried blood. The letters spelled, "Leave." I gasped and slammed the door shut. I backed away, heart racing. I called the hospital security office on my cell. No answer. Suddenly the emergency alarm sounded, piercing and shrill. I ran down the hall to the nurses' station where the staff were gathering, alarmed. Dr. Matthews was on the intercom, saying that the emergency generator had failed and backup systems were kicking in. We were losing power. In the chaos, I went back to room 217. The patient was sitting upright in bed. He looked at me with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I stumbled back, nearly falling. He spoke in a voice that was not his own. Deep, guttural. "Why do you stay?" The lights flickered violently. I ran out of the room, locking the door behind me. I met the charge nurse in the hallway. She looked pale. "We should evacuate," she said. The hospital was running on emergency power, the old wiring sparking intermittently. Staff moved patients to the lobby. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in room 217 and the message in room 219. At 4 a.m., the power was restored. The hospital settled back to normal. We reopened room 219 for cleaning and inspection. The leave writing was gone. Maintenance found no cause for the alarms or power failures. The patient in room 217 was stable, eventually waking with no memory of being unconscious. But I never forgot the night I saw that figure or heard the whispering voices. Sometimes on quiet nights when the hospital is dark and still, I feel the cold breath of that old building like it's alive. And I remember that man's question, "Why do you stay?" Story the end. The night I started working the graveyard shift at St. Mercy Hospital, I thought I was prepared for anything. I'd heard all the usual stories, the whispered rumors about the hospital being haunted, the flickering lights in the old East Wing, and nurses swearing they'd heard footsteps when the halls were empty. But I was young, skeptical, and eager to prove myself as a nurse. The reality turned out to be far more unsettling than any ghost story I'd ever heard. St. Mercy was a regional hospital located in a small town in Ohio, built back in the 1940s. Over the years, it had expanded, but parts of the original structure remained untouched. The East Wing, where a lot of the critical care units were, was one of those areas. It was the oldest part of the hospital, with narrow hallways, peeling paint, and a musty smell that lingered no matter how often they cleaned. During the day, the wing was busy and bustling, but at night, it took on a completely different character, dark, quiet, and cold. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift in the intensive care unit. My first few nights passed with nothing out of the ordinary, aside from the typical hospital noises, the steady beep of monitors, the hum of ventilators, the occasional paging announcements over the intercom. I made my rounds, checked on patients, updated charts, and brewed terrible hospital coffee in the small break room. It was on my 5th night that things started to change. Around 2:30 a.m., I was finishing up charting for a patient in room 212, a man recovering from pneumonia. The lights were dimmed low, and the hallway outside was empty. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd, the faint sound of soft humming. At first, I thought it was just the air conditioning unit, but the melody was deliberate. It was a lullaby, sung quietly, almost as if someone was trying not to be heard. I froze in the doorway, listening intently. The humming grew slightly louder, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I glanced down the hallway. Empty. No other staff around. No visitors. Trying to shake off the creeping feeling, I walked back to the nurse's station. My hands trembled slightly as I poured a cup of coffee. The clock on the wall read 2:35 a.m. I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on my ears. Hospitals were full of odd sounds. I needed to get used to it. Later that night, while making my rounds, I passed the nurse's break room. The door was cracked open, and inside the TV was on. But the room should have been empty. All the other night staff were working their stations or in patient rooms. The glow from the screen spilled into the hallway, and I could see a faint figure sitting at the table. It was too dark to make out any details. "Hello?" I called softly. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer. The humming began again, soft and sorrowful. Then the figure disappeared. I blinked, and the room was empty. The TV was off. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. I never mentioned that incident to anyone. I didn't want to be labeled crazy or lose credibility as a nurse. But every night after that, the hospital seemed to be alive in ways I couldn't explain. Doors would creak open by themselves, even when the building's security system was fully engaged. Footsteps echoed down empty hallways. Sometimes I'd catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow crossing the far end of a corridor, only to find nothing when I looked. The worst experience happened 2 weeks later. That night, the ICU was unusually quiet. Most patients were stable, some even sleeping peacefully. I was in the medication room preparing a dose when the overhead lights flickered violently and then went out, plunging the hospital into darkness. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing the hallways in a dull red glow. The sudden blackout sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight app as I cautiously stepped into the corridor. I heard hurried footsteps behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. Suddenly, the air grew icy cold. My breath came out in visible puffs. I felt a presence, something watching me. From the shadows, a pale face appeared, an old woman with hollow eyes and long, tangled hair. She wore a nurse's uniform from decades past, stained and worn. She stared at me silently, her expression sad and pleading. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The woman raised a trembling hand and pointed toward room 210. I turned to follow her gaze. Inside the room, I found an empty bed. The monitor was dead and the room was still. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one came. The temperature dropped even further. Then I heard whispering, soft voices chanting my name over and over, growing louder, surrounding me. In a panic, I slammed my shoulder into the door until it burst open. I ran back to the nurse's station, gasping for breath. My coworkers looked at me with concern, but no one believed my story. The power had come back on after a brief outage, and everything seemed normal. Over the next few nights, the presence intensified. The humming, the shadows, the cold spots, they followed me everywhere. I started leaving protective charms in my locker, and I avoided the East Wing unless absolutely necessary. One night, a senior nurse confided in me. "There's been strange occurrences here for decades," she said quietly. The hospital was built on land that was once a small burial ground, and several nurses and patients died under mysterious circumstances. They say the spirits linger. She told me about a nurse named Margaret who had worked in the ICU in the 1950s. Margaret was known for her kindness, but she died tragically young after contracting a fatal infection from a patient. Some say her spirit never left, watching over the hospital, and sometimes trying to communicate. I started researching Margaret's story, and the more I learned, the more the pieces fell into place. The humming was her lullaby, sung to comfort the sick. The pale figure was her. One night, I decided to confront the presence. I stood in the hallway outside room 2110, holding a small photo I found in the hospital archives of Margaret. "Margaret," I whispered, "I'm here. I'm not afraid." The air shimmered, and the temperature rose slightly. I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder, a whisper in the wind, "Thank you." From that night on, the hauntings lessened. The hospital still had its strange moments, but the oppressive feeling lifted. I came to believe that Margaret was protecting the patients, staying close out of love and duty. Years later, I still remember those nights clearly. Working the graveyard shift at St. Mercy wasn't just a job. It was an experience that changed how I see the world, the thin line between the living and those who never left. Story the end. The hospital where I worked as a night shift security guard was an old building on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in Ohio. It wasn't one of those modern glass and steel hospitals. This one was a brick structure from the early 1900s, with creaky floors, narrow hallways, and a basement that hadn't seen any real renovation since World War II. It had the kind of atmosphere that weighed on you, the smells, the silence, the flickering fluorescent lights. All of it combined to make the place feel like it had been holding on to its own history, good and bad, for over a century. My name's Ryan, and I worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was a lonely job, mostly watching security cameras and patrolling empty hallways to make sure no one was wandering where they shouldn't. During the day, the hospital was busy and full of life, but at night, it felt like the building itself exhaled into silence. I liked the quiet at first. It gave me space to think and time to read or listen to podcasts during my breaks. But after a while, the quiet started to feel like something else entirely. It all began about 3 weeks into my job. The night shift wasn't completely empty. There were a few patients on the upper floors, mostly in long-term care, but the sections I patrolled on the first and second floors were often deserted. The building's original emergency room had been closed off for years, left untouched since it was relocated to a new wing on the opposite side of the hospital. That old wing was the place I was assigned to check thoroughly every hour. On one particularly cold November night, I was making my routine rounds through the old wing, flashlight in hand, when I heard a faint tapping noise coming from one of the patient rooms at the far end of the hallway. The door was closed, but the light inside flickered weakly. I stopped and listened. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone gently drumming their fingers on the windowsill. I knocked on the door and called out softly, "Hello? Nurse's station?" No response. The tapping stopped. I opened the door slowly and shone my light inside. The room was empty except for a chair by the window and a small table cluttered with medical supplies. The window was shut tight. No breeze could have caused the tapping. I shrugged and shut the door quietly, chalking it up to old pipes or the building settling. But the tapping continued, every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., always from the same room. I mentioned it to one of the nurses on the day shift, who told me that the room had once belonged to a woman named Mrs. Sullivan, who had died there in the late 1950s. She was a patient with tuberculosis, isolated in that room until she passed away. According to the nurse, the hospital staff had always kept that room locked out of respect, but no one had dared to renovate or use it again. That explained the tapping. Maybe an old branch brushing against the window? Or maybe some loose window pane rattling? I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Then the lights started acting up. It began with flickering in the hallway lights near that same room. I'd be walking down the hall, and the bulbs would dim or go out, only to suddenly flicker back on seconds later. Sometimes the lights would completely shut off for several minutes, leaving me in near total darkness, save for my flashlight. One night, during a power outage, I was checking the fuse box in the basement when I heard a soft humming coming from one of the nearby vents. It wasn't mechanical. It was more like a low chant, a repetitive sound that sent a chill down my spine. I hurried back upstairs, the hairs on my neck standing on end. At the nurse's station, Angela, the only other person working nights, was looking at me curiously. "What's wrong?" she asked. I told her about the humming, the flickering lights, and the tapping. She nodded. "There's a story about this hospital, something about the old wing." She went on to explain that the hospital was built on the site of an old farmhouse that had burned down decades before. The original owners, a family named the Whitakers, had perished in the fire. Some say their spirits never left. I laughed nervously. "Ghost stories, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but some nights the nurses swear they hear footsteps in the hallways when no one's there." And then the footsteps started following me. At first it was subtle, a faint sound behind me as I walked the halls. I'd turn around, but there was nothing. Then, on one occasion, I distinctly heard heavy boots pacing slowly just outside the janitor's closet. I checked. Empty. Another time, I saw a shadow dart past the end of the hall. I started keeping a small digital recorder with me. I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining things. One night, around 2:45 a.m., I set it on the floor near the old wing's elevator shaft, a spot where the footsteps and tapping seemed strongest. Later, I listened to the recording. There was silence at first, then a faint knocking, then breathing, and finally, a whispered voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman calling out, "Help me." The hairs on my arms stood up. I felt like I was about to throw up. I didn't want to stay anymore. The next night, I told Angela I was leaving early. But before I could leave, the fire alarm went off. The loud, piercing alarm echoed through the empty halls. I grabbed the radio and tried to contact the control room. No response. I checked the fire panels. All normal. No smoke, no heat. The alarm kept blaring. I ran toward the source, the old wing. When I reached the hallway, the alarm stopped abruptly. The lights went out. The temperature dropped suddenly. I felt cold air rush past me like a gust from nowhere. Then I saw her. At the end of the hall, a woman in a long white dress. Her face was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. She didn't move, but her presence filled the corridor. I froze. The lights flickered on again, and she was gone. I called it in the next day. Maintenance came, inspected the wiring, found nothing wrong. The hospital director was skeptical, but I quit that night. I couldn't handle the fear. Months later, I read online about a similar hospital nearby that had been haunted by the ghost of a woman who died in isolation during the 1950s. They called her the White Lady. I think I saw her. Sometimes I wonder if she was trying to warn me about something, or maybe she just wanted someone to remember. I never went back to that hospital, but I still hear the tapping sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. Story the end. Working the night shift at a hospital in rural Ohio wasn't something I had planned for, but it paid the bills. I was a CNA, certified nursing assistant, and the hospital was small, old, and not exactly state-of-the-art. It had this low buzz of fluorescent lights and constant hum of machines that never fully let you relax, even when the halls were empty and the night was dead silent. I'd been working there for about 6 months, usually from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., taking care of patients, helping nurses, and running errands. The night shift was quieter, sure, but it had its own kind of tension. People were asleep, except when they weren't. The elderly patients who were lucid sometimes told stories that sounded more like warnings or confessions than idle talk. One night, about 3 months into the job, something happened that I still can't explain. It was a Tuesday. The hospital was unusually empty. 2 patients in my ward, the rest either discharged or in other departments. I was finishing up a routine check on Mr. Thompson, an older gentleman with congestive heart failure who was mostly bedridden. I adjusted his oxygen, checked his vitals, and then turned to head back toward the nurse's station. As I passed room 306, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes doors didn't close fully, especially older ones. But tonight, I felt something odd. A chill in the air, or maybe it was just my imagination. I paused, glanced inside, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Not a patient. Not a nurse. A shadowy silhouette standing at the foot of the bed. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I could sense it was watching me. I blinked hard, and it vanished. I told myself it was just fatigue. The hospital's dim lighting playing tricks on me. I kept going. About an hour later, I was in the break room heating some coffee when the fire alarm suddenly went off. Not the usual beep, but a long, piercing wail. The entire hospital shook with the noise. Staff scrambled. The patients stirred. I grabbed my radio and tried to figure out what was going on, but no one could tell me anything. The alarm system showed no fire detected anywhere. It was just going off, and it wouldn't stop. Over the radio, the head nurse told everyone to evacuate the floor. The night was chaotic. Patients wheeled out in beds, nurses calling codes. I followed orders but felt uneasy. As I walked toward the stairwell, the alarm stopped suddenly, cutting off like someone had flipped a switch. The hall went silent again. When I looked back toward room 306, the door slammed shut on its own with a loud bang. I swear I heard whispering coming from inside. When morning came, the maintenance team checked the alarm system. They found nothing wrong, no faults, no triggers. Just a normal system. But the feeling stayed with me. Then, over the next few weeks, strange things happened on my shifts. Doors would open and close by themselves. Lights would flicker, even though all the circuits tested fine. Patients who were otherwise stable reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways, or seeing people standing by their beds, people who disappeared when looked at directly. One night, Mrs. Daniels, a patient with early-stage dementia, told me she was scared of the man in the shadows who came to visit her at night. She described him as tall, dressed in old-fashioned hospital clothes, with pale skin and hollow eyes. I laughed it off, assuming it was confusion or dreams. But one night, I saw him too. I was doing rounds around 4 a.m., walking down the West Wing corridor. The hall was dimly lit, the silence broken only by the distant beeping of monitors. As I passed room 306 again, the door was open this time. Inside, on the floor, was the shadowy figure. It looked at me, not with anger or menace, but with deep sorrow. It raised a hand slowly, almost as if beckoning me closer. I couldn't move. My heart raced. Then the lights flickered, and the figure dissolved into mist. After that, I started asking around. The older staff told me the hospital had a history. Back in the 1940s, the building had been a tuberculosis sanatorium. Many patients died there, and some after long, painful stays. A man named Samuel was one of the first orderlies. He died of pneumonia during a harsh winter and was said to still walk the halls. I tried to find records on Samuel, but came up with little. Just a few old photographs and handwritten notes mentioning his dedication. One night, the power went out for nearly an hour. The backup generators kicked in, but the hospital was pitch black for the longest time. I was alone on my floor. I heard footsteps coming closer, slow and steady, echoing in the darkness. The old nurse's station phone started ringing. I answered it, but there was only static on the line. Then a whisper. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I hung up and bolted to the emergency lights, which finally flickered on. I left the floor immediately and didn't return until morning. After that, I transferred to a day shift job in a bigger hospital, but I'll never forget those nights. I learned that some places keep memories, pain, loss, and sorrow that don't just fade. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you get to see those memories come alive. Story the end. The first time I felt something truly wrong during a night shift, I was barely 2 weeks into my job as a security guard at a mid-sized hospital in upstate New York. I had taken the night shift to pick up extra hours and pay some bills while I finished college, never thinking twice about the old rumors swirling around the place. The hospital had been there for almost a century, and like many old hospitals, it had its share of stories. Strange noises, ghost sightings, unexplained events. I always figured those were just the kind of things people said to pass the time during boring night shifts. My shift started at 11 p.m. I arrived early, got my security badge, and went to the security office on the ground floor. The building was mostly quiet after dark. Most patients were asleep, the halls dimly lit by overhead fluorescents humming softly. My job was straightforward. Patrol the building, check locked doors, monitor security cameras, and respond to any disturbances. The hospital had a wing that was closed to patients. At least that's what I was told. It was the old psychiatric ward, shut down over 20 years ago after the hospital renovated and expanded. Nobody was supposed to enter it, but the staff said it was still there, mostly sealed off except for a few maintenance visits. One of my first rounds took me near that wing. The hallways were long and narrow, the walls peeling paint, the air musty with a faint chemical scent. As I walked, I heard what sounded like faint footsteps behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. I shrugged it off as the building settling. On my third night, around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds near that wing again. The air grew noticeably colder, and the silence became heavier, like the kind of silence that presses in so much you feel you can't breathe. I stopped outside the locked door that led to the old ward. The padlock was rusted, but the door looked solid. Suddenly, I heard a low moan from inside. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakably human. I called out, "Hello? Security here? Is anyone in there?" No response. Then a faint tapping started, like fingers lightly drumming on the other side of the door. I moved away slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Over the next few nights, things escalated. Doors to the old wing would rattle despite being locked tight. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving behind the frosted glass windows. Sometimes, when I checked the security monitors, the feed from that area would glitch or go completely black for a few seconds. One night, I was monitoring the cameras from the security office when a figure appeared in the hallway outside the old ward. It was a woman in a hospital gown, pale and thin, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. She stood perfectly still for a moment, then slowly turned her head toward the camera as if she knew I was watching. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, she was gone. I tried to report it to my supervisor, but he just laughed it off. "Probably some patient playing tricks, or maybe a bug in the system," he said. "Don't let the old building get to you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. A week later, the tapping returned, this time louder and more insistent. It sounded like someone knocking, trying to get in. I followed the noise to the corridor near the old wing. The door was still locked, but the knocking persisted. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the hall into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in with a dim red glow, barely enough to see by. I pulled out my flashlight and scanned the corridor. There was no one there. But then, from behind me, I heard a soft voice whisper my name. I spun around, shining my light in every direction. Nothing. I called for backup, but no one answered. My radio crackled with static. I started walking back toward the security office, but as I passed the nurse's station, the radio on the desk burst to life with garbled voices and distorted cries. The monitor screens flashed with static and brief images of patients I didn't recognize, faces twisted in pain or fear. I didn't stop to look longer. I bolted to the security office, locked the door, and called the police. When the maintenance crew arrived the next day, they found no faults in the wiring or equipment. The security footage showed no one entering or exiting the old wing during my shifts. The next few nights were worse. I started hearing footsteps following me during my patrols, echoing through empty hallways. Sometimes I felt cold breaths on the back of my neck or saw fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision. The whispers grew louder, indistinct words, calls for help, pleas to leave. One night, while checking the east wing, I found the door to an unused patient room slightly ajar. The room was cold and dark. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered, then went out. In the pitch black, I felt something brush past me. A cold, wet touch on my arm. I scrambled to open the door, and when it finally gave way, I stumbled out into the hallway, shaking. I reported it, but my coworkers called me paranoid. The hospital administration offered no explanation. The worst night came 3 weeks after I started. It was around 3 a.m., and I was alone in the security office, monitoring cameras when suddenly every screen flickered to static. Then one camera showed a close-up of a man's face, pale, hollow eyes, expressionless. It stared straight into the camera for several seconds before vanishing. I felt my blood run cold. Then the fire alarms blared throughout the building. I grabbed my radio and called the front desk. They said the alarms were false, but I could hear shouting from the corridors outside the security office. I stepped out and saw lights flashing as several staff members ran down the halls. Suddenly, the old ward's door burst open. A gust of freezing air swept through the hospital. From the dark corridor emerged a crowd of ghostly figures, patients in old-fashioned hospital gowns, their faces gaunt and eyes empty. They drifted silently down the hallway, passing through walls and doors. I froze, unable to move or speak. One of them, a woman, turned to me. Her eyes locked on mine, filled with sadness and desperation. She mouthed, "Help us." Then the figures vanished. The alarms stopped. The hospital returned to silence. I quit the job that morning. I never told anyone the full story. Most would never believe it. But I know what I saw that night. And sometimes when I close my eyes in a quiet room, I still hear the tapping, the whispers, and the soft pleading for help from those who never left. Story, the end. The hospital was a relic of another era. Brick and mortar with peeling paint, creaky wooden floors beneath the scuffed tile, and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. I started working there as a security officer on the night shift in the spring of 2018. The job was simple enough: patrol the building, monitor the cameras, respond to any alarms or disturbances, and keep the place secure until the morning staff arrived. I was assigned the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, which most people avoided, especially since the hospital was largely empty overnight, except for a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors. The building itself had a reputation. Old-timers whispered stories about unexplained noises, strange sightings, and even patients who'd passed away but never seemed to leave. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But I was no stranger to the eerie feeling that could settle in such places at night. The first couple of weeks were quiet, almost too quiet. I'd patrol the halls with my flashlight and radio, the steady beep of the monitors and the hum of fluorescent lights, the only sounds. But it was the third night when things started to feel off. It was around 2 a.m. when I was walking down the West Wing corridor near the old maternity ward. That part of the hospital had been closed for years, sealed off behind heavy fire doors. The hospital administration had plans to renovate it someday, but for now, it was off limits. I'd heard from my supervisor that sometimes the automatic locks would malfunction, and once in a while the doors would swing open by themselves. That night, as I passed the large double doors leading to the maternity ward, I saw one of them slightly ajar. A sliver of dim light flickered inside. I stopped and shined my flashlight through the gap. The room beyond was dark and empty. At least it looked that way. I pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges creaking like an old ship. The air smelled stale, heavy with the scent of disinfectant long gone sour. The room was empty except for a single rocking chair in the corner, gently moving back and forth on its own. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was probably the draft from the ventilation system, but the chair's slow rocking was hypnotic, almost like it was inviting me to sit. As I stood frozen, I heard a faint sound, a soft lullaby humming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around but saw nothing but peeling paint and cracked tiles. My pulse quickened. I decided to step back out into the corridor, but as I did, the lights flickered violently and the humming stopped abruptly. I called my supervisor to report the door and the strange rocking chair, but she brushed it off. Old building, she said. The wind gets in sometimes. Just don't go poking around where you're not supposed to. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued my rounds. Weeks passed, but the strange events didn't stop. On one occasion, I was in the security office reviewing camera footage when I caught a glimpse of a figure walking down the hallway in the maternity ward. The timestamp was 3:17 a.m. I rewound and watched again. The figure was a woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1950s, her face pale and expressionless. She seemed to glide rather than walk. I alerted the hospital management, but they dismissed it as a glitch. One night, while doing my patrol near the basement corridors, I heard whispers coming from the utility rooms. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. I called out, but no one answered. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The corridor was empty. I was starting to dread my shifts. Sleep became difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rocking chair moving slowly, the pale nurse's face staring at me. One night, near the end of my shift, I was walking past the old chapel on the hospital's 3rd floor. The chapel had been closed for years after a fire damaged part of the roof. The windows were boarded up, but I noticed a faint light coming from inside. Curious and against my better judgment, I tried the door. Surprisingly, it was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and thick with dust. The faint light flickered from a small candle burning on the altar. I felt drawn to it, stepping closer. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Turning quickly, I saw the same pale nurse standing silently in the doorway. She raised her hands slowly and pointed toward the back of the chapel. I followed her gaze to a cracked statue of the Virgin Mary. At its base was a small box. I opened it and found several old letters and a photograph of a young nurse holding a baby. The letters detailed the nurse's efforts to care for abandoned infants during a time when the hospital was overwhelmed. They also spoke of mysterious deaths and cover-ups. The nurse's name was Margaret. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The candle flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I ran out of the chapel, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. From that night on, I carried the photograph with me, tucked safely in my jacket. The hospital finally closed the West Wing months later, citing safety concerns. I quit shortly after. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself humming that same lullaby. And when I close my eyes, I still see the pale nurse's face and the rocking chair gently moving in the dark. Story the end. The night I first encountered what I can only describe as a ghost happened about 7 years ago, when I was working the overnight security shift at an old manufacturing plant in western Pennsylvania. The plant was a sprawling complex, mostly abandoned, but still operating on a limited basis. My job was to monitor the premises during the graveyard shift, mainly to prevent trespassing and theft. It was boring work, the kind that makes time crawl. But sometimes, in the silence, you realize there are things that aren't explained by logic or reason. The plant had been around since the 1940s, making steel parts for the automotive industry. Over the decades, it had seen its share of accidents and deaths. Men crushed by heavy machinery, some falling into vats of molten metal, others trapped during fires. It was the kind of place where the air smelled of rust and old oil, and the floors always seemed to hold a thin film of dust and grease. Management didn't want to publicize the grim history, but the workers all talked about it quietly among themselves. I was a college student at the time, studying engineering, and I took the night job to help pay tuition. The plant was mostly shut down, but the security office was housed in a small, glass-paneled booth near the main gate. I spent most of my nights staring at monitors showing black and white feeds of empty warehouses, fenced lots, and deserted parking areas. One night, about 3 weeks into the job, I started my shift at 11 p.m. The weather was cold and damp. I had my thermos of coffee and a bag of snacks prepared for the long hours ahead. For the first few hours, nothing happened beyond the occasional passing car or stray raccoon rummaging through the garbage bins. Around 2 a.m., as I was scrolling through the camera feeds, I noticed something odd on one of the monitors. The feed from the old foundry building, which was closed off and unused, showed a faint, flickering light inside. It looked like a lantern, moving slowly through the dark space. That building was off limits. No one was supposed to be there, especially at night. I checked the perimeter alarms, but none had been triggered. Curious and slightly uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The yard was silent except for the crunch of my boots on gravel. As I approached the foundry, I could see nothing but darkness through the broken windows. The light on the monitor flickered again, then vanished. I called the plant manager's cell phone to report what I'd seen, but there was no answer. I decided to keep watch from the outside for a few minutes, shining my flashlight into the windows, but nothing moved. Just as I was turning to head back to the office, I heard a faint clanging noise coming from inside the foundry, like metal striking metal. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was a loose pipe or a rat, but the sound was deliberate. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the building's back exit. I spun toward the door but saw no one. I rushed back to the security booth and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. Over the next few nights, strange things kept happening. Lights would flicker on and off in parts of the plant that had no electricity. The motion sensors near the scrapyard would trip, but when I went to check, there was nothing. One night, I heard what sounded like voices coming from the boiler room, low, mournful, and indecipherable. When I played back the audio recorded by the security cameras, I could hear whispers saying, "Help me," over and over. The employees who worked during the day avoided talking about these occurrences, but the older maintenance workers told stories of ghosts, spirits of men who died in terrible accidents, still wandering the plant. One particular story was about a man named Frank, who was crushed in a press machine in the 1950s. Workers said his spirit lingered near the foundry, sometimes seen as a shadowy figure. Then came the night I almost lost my sanity. It was a late November night, the kind where the wind howled through the cracks in the old building. Around 3 a.m., the power went out across the entire plant. Emergency generators kicked in after a minute, but the security booth was plunged into darkness. My flashlight was dead. The batteries must have died earlier. I sat frozen, my ears straining to catch any sound. Then footsteps, close, slow, deliberate, echoed from the parking lot outside. I grabbed the radio and tried to call the manager, but the static was overwhelming. Suddenly, the booth's glass shattered inward. I ducked instinctively and felt a cold breath on my neck. I turned and saw a figure standing there, translucent, glowing faintly blue. It was a man in an old-style work uniform, his face gaunt, eyes hollow. He raised a hand, pointing toward the foundry. I couldn't move. Then the figure vanished. I gathered myself and bolted toward the foundry entrance. The door was slightly open. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. I saw footprints in the dust, fresh, yet faintly glowing. I followed them until they stopped in front of the old press machine. There, lying on the floor, was an old oil can, spilled and rusted. Suddenly, the room was filled with whispers. "Help me! Help me!" I stumbled back outside and ran to the booth. When dawn broke, the plant manager arrived. I told him everything. He sighed and said, "Frank's been haunting this place for decades." The plant shut down soon after. I never went back. Sometimes I still dream about that night, the cold air, the broken glass, the desperate whispers, and the ghost who needed help he could never get. Story the end. The night shift was supposed to be easy money. I took the job as a security guard at an old municipal hospital in a small town in Pennsylvania while I was between gigs. The hospital was the kind of place that everyone in town knew had some dark history, but nobody talked about openly. An old brick building dating back to the 1920s, with multiple expansions and renovations added haphazardly over the decades. During the day, the place was bustling with patients, nurses, and doctors. But at night, especially in the winter months when the nights stretched long and cold, the place turned into something else. Silent halls, the occasional groan of the building settling, and a pervasive chill that seemed to seep through the walls. I'd never believed in ghosts or anything paranormal, but after a few weeks of working the graveyard shift there, I started to wonder if maybe there was something to the stories. The first incident that unnerved me happened about 2 weeks into the job. I was making my usual rounds, checking the East Wing, a part of the hospital that was rarely used anymore except for storage and a couple of long-term patients. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was alone. The halls were dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs, some of which buzzed softly, others so old that they flickered on and off in uneven rhythms. As I walked past room 213, I thought I heard something, a faint tapping, like a finger drumming on wood. I stopped, listening carefully, but when I looked in the window of the door, the room was empty. I shrugged it off and continued. Later that night, near the nurse's station, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing down the corridor. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The hall was empty. The silence afterward was crushing. At first, I figured it was just my imagination, or the echo of sounds bouncing around the empty hallways. But then more things happened. One night, I was sitting in the security office monitoring cameras when I noticed something strange on the feed. The camera facing the old psychiatric wing, closed down for decades but still intact, flickered and then showed a figure standing in the hallway. It was blurry but unmistakable. A woman in a hospital gown, hair tangled, pale face turned toward the camera. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, the hallway was empty. I called the nurse on duty to check, but she said she hadn't seen anyone. When I asked about the psychiatric wing, she lowered her voice and told me it was shut off because of safety concerns, but some staff refused to go near it. Rumors said the patients who had once been there never really left. The next few nights brought more occurrences, whispered voices down empty halls, doors creaking open by themselves, cold spots so intense I could see my breath inside the building. One particularly cold night, I was doing rounds in the basement. The hospital's boiler room was down there, along with the storage area and some old equipment no one used. As I walked down the damp concrete corridor, I heard a woman crying softly. I called out but got no answer. When I followed the sound, it led me to a locked metal door. The crying stopped as soon as I reached it. The lock was rusted but solid. I couldn't get in. I kept hearing the crying on subsequent nights, always near that door. I later found out from an old maintenance worker that the door led to an old morgue that had been closed off for decades. The hospital had buried most of the bodies in a nearby cemetery, but some were never claimed. One night, about a month into the job, I was checking the east wing when the lights flickered violently, then went out entirely. The emergency backup lights came on, casting an eerie red glow. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. I shivered, wrapping my jacket tighter around me. Then from the darkness ahead I saw it, a figure slowly materializing in the hallway. A man, gaunt and pale, wearing a tattered hospital gown. His eyes were sunken, and he looked straight at me with a haunting, sorrowful gaze. I froze, unable to move. The figure raised a hand slowly, as if reaching out. Then, with a sudden whoosh, he vanished. I stumbled back to the security office, heart pounding, hands shaking. After that night, I tried to avoid the East Wing as much as possible, but the phenomena continued. The whispers became clearer, often repeating a single word, help. One night, the radio I carried started crackling with static, and then a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably human, called my name. I called out, "Who's there?" but got only silence. On my last night before quitting, things reached a terrifying peak. I was making my rounds near the old psychiatric wing when the fire alarm suddenly blared. Red lights flashed, the entire building shaken by the noise. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact the front desk, but the radio was dead. Then the lights went out. In the pitch black, I heard footsteps all around me. Fast, chaotic, many sets coming from every direction. I felt cold hands grab my arms, my shoulders. I screamed, struggling to break free. The lights flickered back on, and I was alone. Shaken and terrified, I packed my stuff the next morning and left. I never returned. The hospital continues to operate, but no one I know works the night shift anymore. Sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I still hear the tapping, the whispers, and feel the cold breath on my neck. I believe now. Some places never forget what happened there, and some spirits never find rest. Story the end. The old hospital sat on the outskirts of town, a brick building with cracked windows and a faded sign that read Millbrook General. I had been hired a few months earlier to work the night shift in the emergency department, a place that came alive under the flickering glow of fluorescent lights when the rest of the city was quiet. Everyone said the building had a history, stories of patients who never left, unexplained noises, cold spots. But as a nurse trained in the Midwest, I considered those tales nothing more than hospital folklore. My first few weeks were unremarkable, just the usual midnight chaos. Intoxicated patients, injuries from bar fights, and the occasional late-night panic attack. But the night of October 17th, 2018, changed everything. It was around 1:30 a.m., and the ER was slow. I was reviewing charts when the lights flickered twice. The overhead fluorescent panels buzzed and dimmed for a moment before flickering back on. Just as I shook my head, thinking about how old the building was, the power went out entirely. The whole hospital was swallowed by darkness. The emergency generator kicked in a few seconds later, but only the hallway lights glowed faintly in a sickly red. The patients were calm, some confused, but no one was panicking. I was assigned to monitor a man in room 212 who had come in with severe chest pain earlier in the evening. When I entered the room with my flashlight, he was sitting up in bed, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. "Mr. Daniels?" I called softly. He didn't respond. As I reached out to check his pulse, I noticed his skin was colder than it should have been, almost clammy. The air in the room was heavy, and a strange scent of old smoke lingered faintly. Suddenly, a whisper echoed just outside the door, barely audible. I froze, heart racing. The whisper was incoherent but urgent, like someone calling for help. I opened the door to look out into the dim hallway, but no one was there. Shaking, I went back to the room and checked the monitors. They showed his heartbeat steady, but there was a strange static interference on the screen. Then the overhead speaker crackled with static, and through the noise, a voice whispered my name. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the dark corners of the room. "Lisa, help me," the voice said. It sounded like it was coming from the ventilation ducts above. The hospital had been retrofitted with an old ventilation system, and sometimes the ducts carried odd noises, but this was different, urgent, desperate. Suddenly the lights flickered back on. The eerie feeling evaporated, and Mr. Daniels blinked and looked around, confused. He told me he'd heard voices in the night, whispers that kept him awake. I tried to reassure him it was just the hospital noises. Later that night, as I made my rounds, I passed by the old maternity ward, which had been shut down for decades. The corridor was bathed in darkness, except for the red emergency exit lights. I could hear faint music, a lullaby, soft and distant. Curious, I peered inside the room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, and I saw a rocking chair moving slowly back and forth, though there was no breeze. I backed away quickly. In the staff break room, the radio had turned on by itself, playing an old song from the 1950s, Blue Moon. It continued for several minutes before cutting off abruptly. Over the following weeks, other strange things happened. Items went missing and reappeared. Doors would open and close on their own, and the smell of smoke, that same faint scent, appeared and vanished without cause. One night, a fellow nurse told me about a young woman named Emily, who died in the hospital many years ago during childbirth in that very maternity ward. Rumor had it she lingered, unable to leave, watching over the babies born in the hospital ever since. I didn't want to believe it, but then I saw her. It was about 3 a.m., and I was walking down the third-floor corridor toward the break room when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a woman, pale and dressed in a faded white gown, standing near the end of the hallway. When I blinked, she was gone. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. One night, during a power outage, I heard a baby crying coming from the old maternity ward. I followed the sound, heart pounding. The room was empty except for an old crib rocking gently. The crying stopped as soon as I entered. The hospital maintenance team found nothing wrong with the wiring and no record of any recent patients in the old maternity ward. I eventually moved to a different hospital, but the memories stayed with me. Sometimes I swear I can still hear the lullaby playing softly on a forgotten radio, and on quiet nights, when I close my eyes, I see her, watching, waiting. Story, the end. It was late September when I started my new job as a night security guard at the River Heights Medical Archive facility in Dayton, Ohio. The place was a converted building that once served as a small hospital, long since decommissioned and gutted to store old records. Every floor was filled with shelves of manila folders, boxed documents, and steel filing cabinets that seemed like they hadn't been touched in decades. Most of my job involved walking through the same loops every night with a flashlight and a clipboard, checking doors, making sure nothing was out of place, and logging it all. My supervisor, James, was a stiff, no-nonsense man in his 50s who clearly didn't like to talk more than necessary. On my first night, he gave me the layout, handed me the key cards, and warned me not to go near the sub-basement unless there was an emergency. When I asked why, he just said, "That area's sealed for a reason. Records nobody's supposed to touch. You got no business down there." At first, the shifts were peaceful. Boring, mostly. I'd walk the floors from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., making rounds every hour. No windows on most floors, only the ground level had a few at the entrance. The building always had this damp, musty smell to it, and the fluorescent lights overhead would hum just a little too loud. You get used to things like that. But then small things started happening. On my third night, I was logging the storage status on the third floor when I thought I heard someone walking a few rows behind me. Just a soft shuffle, like shoes on concrete. When I looked around, nothing was there. I told myself it was probably just echo from my own steps. The fifth night, I found a single file cabinet open on the second floor that I was certain I had closed. I shrugged it off, closed it, and kept walking. It wasn't until the second week that I started feeling truly uneasy. At around 2:40 a.m., I was in the staff break room on the first floor, sipping cold coffee and flipping through my log when the motion sensor monitor pinged. One of the cameras, Cam 4, which faced the emergency stairwell, flickered on and showed what looked like a person standing just inside the stairwell door. The figure was still, head down, wearing something white. I stared for a moment, expecting them to move, but the figure didn't. I blinked, leaned forward. The feed fuzzed out for a second, then cleared up again. Now the stairwell was empty. I walked over to the door and opened it, flashlight ready. Nothing. I went up and down the stairs, even poked my head onto each floor. Nobody. I chalked it up to a glitch, but my gut didn't agree. 2 nights later, I was walking the fourth floor. This was one of the quieter ones. A cold breeze hit me out of nowhere. And I swear it carried the faint scent of antiseptic, the kind you smell in hospitals. I paused and turned in place. That's when I noticed that about 20 feet ahead, one of the long ceiling lights was flickering badly. As I approached it, I caught sight of movement at the end of the aisle. Just a brief flash like someone in a patient gown stepping between 2 rows of shelves. I stopped. "Hello?" I called, not really expecting an answer. Silence. I waited for a moment, then walked forward slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. The hairs on my arms stood up. There was no one there. But as I passed the shelves, I noticed something odd. File drawers slightly ajar, 4 in a row, like someone had walked by and opened them with their fingertips. That part unnerved me more than the flicker or the figure. It felt intentional. By my third week, the night shifts had become a nerve-shredding mix of anxiety and confusion. And I started noticing a pattern. Whatever was happening always began around 2:40 a.m. I stopped taking breaks during that time. I just keep moving, eyes scanning, heart thudding. Then came the night I couldn't explain away. It was a Sunday, dead quiet. The outside world might as well not have existed. Around 2:35 a.m., I was on the second floor when I heard a soft, rhythmic knocking. 3 knocks. Then silence. 3 more. I followed the sound toward the western wing. It was coming from a supply closet that hadn't been opened since I started working. I approached slowly, listening. The knocking stopped when I reached the door. I hesitated, then turned the handle. The door creaked open. Inside were mops, brooms, buckets, and a pair of wet, bare footprints on the tile floor leading toward the back wall of the closet. But there was no one in there. That was the first time I seriously considered quitting. I didn't sleep at all the next day. I kept going over the footage from the hallway cams, but nothing showed. No sound, no figure, no knocking. That night, I came in with a small audio recorder and clipped it to my vest. Just before 3 a.m., I was on the 4th floor when I heard what sounded like whispering. Not loud, more like a breath brushing against your ear. I froze. My flashlight flickered once and then steadied. I couldn't make out any words, just the sound of someone murmuring, close but invisible. Then I heard a voice say, clearly, "Don't let them out." I whipped around. No one. I bolted to the stairwell and nearly tripped getting down to the 1st floor. My whole body was shaking. When I got back to the security room, I ripped the recorder off my vest and played it back. The whispering was there. But the voice that followed wasn't mine. It was a woman, soft, strained. "Don't let them out. They're not people." I couldn't move for a full minute. The next day, I confronted James. I told him what I'd seen and heard. He listened without blinking, then leaned back and sighed. "You should transfer," he said. "What?" "Look, this place, it's not like the others. It's not just files and mold. I don't know what's in this building, but something stayed behind when they shut down the hospital. Back in the early 90s, there was an incident. A psychiatric patient wandered into the records room and hung herself with a catheter cord. Took them hours to find her. No explanation how she got out of her ward. No cameras back then." He stood and poured himself a cup of black coffee. "After that, things changed. Guards quit. Cleaners wouldn't come upstairs. We sealed the sub-basement a year later, but it didn't help." "Why not just shut the building down?" I asked. James gave a tired smile. "Money. I should have left then. I should have packed up and walked out, but I didn't. I stayed. I told myself one more week and I'd quit." But the building didn't let up. On my final shift, I came in just before midnight. The air was heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were pressing inward. I moved faster during my rounds, glancing over my shoulder more than usual. I had the recorder again and a second flashlight just in case. At 2:41 a.m., every light on the third floor went out at once, not flickered, just died. I walked toward the stairwell, then froze when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned and shone my light. At the end of the hall, standing in front of the elevator, was a woman in a stained hospital gown. Her hair hung limp over her face, and her arms dangled unnaturally at her sides. She began walking toward me. I shouted, "Stop!" She didn't. The lights behind her blinked, then shattered one by one. The air turned icy. I backed away, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break my ribs. She stopped about 20 feet away. Her face slowly lifted. Her eyes were gone. Just dark, gaping sockets where they should have been. Her mouth opened and I heard that same voice from the recorder, "Don't let them out." Then everything went black. I woke up in the security room hours later, lying on the floor. The camera feeds were normal. Lights were on. That's nothing broken. I went to James and handed in my badge without saying a word. He didn't ask why. I moved to Cleveland the next month, got a job at a small office complex with day shifts only. No records, no sub-basements, no flickering lights. Sometimes I still hear whispering around 2:40 in the morning. I don't check. Story the end. It was early October when I took a night shift security job at the old St. Mary's Regional Hospital in upstate New York. The place hadn't been operational as a hospital in nearly a decade. They had shut it down after years of poor funding and declining patient intake, and the building had since been sold to the city. The plan was to renovate and convert it into an assisted living facility. But renovation had stalled, and for over 2 years, it had sat quiet and half-gutted. My job was simple: make sure no one trespassed and nothing caught fire. They were paying me a bit above minimum wage, and I wasn't in a place to argue. The hospital was massive, 7 floors including the basement, with wings that sprawled in both directions. Half the time, I didn't even patrol the full, only checking key points and logging my visits every hour in a binder. There were working cameras in only a few hallways, but none of them had audio, and most of the place had no power. A flashlight, a walkie, and a keyring were all I had. The first few nights were boring, which I didn't mind. I'd bring a thermos of coffee and a couple sandwiches, read on my phone when I could get a signal, or walk around humming just to hear my own echo. It was cold in there, colder than it should have been in early fall, especially the East Wing, where the operating rooms used to be. I started avoiding that wing when I didn't need to go, not because of any specific incident, just a feeling, heavy like the walls were pressing in. On my 5th night, I brought an old portable radio with me, my dad's. It was one of those cheap AM/FM ones with the wire antenna. I couldn't get a solid station, but I liked the static. It was better than the silence. I clipped it onto my belt and did my rounds with it on low. That night, around 2:30 a.m., I was on the 4th floor near what used to be the maternity ward when the radio suddenly cut from static into a voice. Not a station, just a voice. A woman's. Soft, muffled. I froze. I don't remember what she said exactly, but it wasn't English. It was a whisper, too faint to understand. Then it popped back to static. I checked my surroundings. Nothing but shadows and the dusty remains of equipment. I turned the radio off and pocketed it. I convinced myself it had picked up interference. Maybe a trucker's CB radio, maybe a fluke. But I started walking a little faster, and for the rest of the shift, I stayed near the security booth on the first floor. The next night, I debated quitting. But I needed the money, and my roommate was already covering more than his share of rent. So I went back. Everything was quiet until about 3:10 a.m. when I heard something metallic hit the ground in the west wing. I knew the layout pretty well by then. Only one room over there still had metal shelves. Supply room B12. I got there in under a minute. The shelves were undisturbed, but a pair of surgical scissors were lying in the middle of the floor. They weren't rusted like most of the junk left behind. These looked clean. I crouched, staring at them, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. That room had no windows. I was the only one with keys. No signs of forced entry. I checked the cameras after my shift. The hallway camera outside B12 had gone to static for about 45 seconds at exactly 3:08 a.m. On my seventh night, things got worse. I was walking past the old ICU, a row of glass-walled rooms with beds still inside. I glanced into one just casually, and I saw someone sitting up in the bed. I swear to God, it was a man. Bald, pale, wearing what looked like a patient gown. His back was to me. I couldn't see his face. My flashlight trembled as I slowly stepped closer. "Hello?" I called out. He didn't move. I got within 10 feet and raised the light again. The bed was empty. I looked all around. No open doors, no place for someone to go. I opened the door to that room, number 423. No footprints on the dust-covered floor, just an empty bed, old monitors, and that strange, sterile smell. The air was wrong in there. Humid. Like someone had just exhaled. I returned to the security booth and stayed there for the rest of my shift. I signed off at 6 a.m. sharp and drove home shaking. The next day, I brought it up to Ron, the day shift guard, an older guy who mostly napped during his shifts. "Oh, yeah," he said, sipping his gas station coffee. "You've seen him." "Seen who?" I asked. He looked me in the eye for a moment before smirking like he didn't want to freak me out. "People say this place is haunted," he said. "Nurses saw things back in the day. Lights turning on, patients talking to people who weren't there. You know, standard stuff." "You ever seen anything?" I asked. He paused longer than I expected. Then, "Nah, but I only work during the day." That night, I brought sage. I'm not a spiritual guy, but I needed something. I left some in the security booth and walked with a small bundle in my pocket. I didn't see anything for a few hours. But just after 2 a.m., I heard crying from the pediatric ward. It wasn't just faint sobbing, it was full-on wailing, like a child in pain. My stomach dropped as I climbed the stairs, dreading what I'd find. The moment I stepped into the ward, the air grew freezing. My breath puffed visibly in the beam of my flashlight. The sound came from room 515. I opened the door. Empty. The crying stopped the second I entered. Then behind me a whisper. "Help me!" I spun around. No one. The door slowly creaked closed behind me, but I hadn't touched it. I ran. I don't even remember how I got back downstairs. I didn't leave the booth until daylight. I called my supervisor that afternoon and asked to be reassigned. He said I was imagining things, that there was no one else willing to take that night shift, and if I didn't show up, I'd be marked as abandoning post. No unemployment, no severance, nothing. So I went back. The final night started normally, cold, quiet. My radio off, no crying. I tried to stick close to the ground floor. At 3:33 a.m., every hallway light in the east wing came on at once. That wing had no power. I watched it on the security monitor, each light buzzing to life like someone flipping switches as they walked, one by one. I grabbed my flashlight, cursed myself, and went to check it out. The hallway smelled like bleach and something rotting underneath. The lights were flickering wildly, and my flashlight dimmed even though the batteries were fresh. I walked toward the last door on the left, room E27. The light above it buzzed so loudly it hurt my ears. The door was slightly open. I pushed it with one gloved hand and stepped inside. A gurney sat in the middle of the room. On it, a body covered in a sheet. I froze. It was impossible. There hadn't been any patients in years. My mind raced. A prank? A squatter? I stepped closer. The sheet moved, just a slight twitch like someone breathing underneath. I turned and ran. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't sign out. I left the keys and walked straight out the front door. The next morning, I returned to gather my belongings. Ron was there, drinking his coffee like always. "You're done, huh?" he said, not surprised. I just nodded. "You lasted longer than the others." I blinked. "What others?" He smiled weakly and looked out the window. "They don't put it in the job listing, but you're maybe the 5th guy this year." I asked why no one talked about it, why no one warned me. He just said, "Some things want to be left alone." I never went back. Months later, they finally tore the place down. A fire started during demolition. They said it was electrical, but that part of the building had no power. No one was hurt, but a firefighter swore he saw a person inside one of the upper windows during the blaze. A man standing still in a hospital gown staring out at nothing. Story the end. Working the night shift at the hospital was never something I sought out deliberately. But after a year of day jobs that barely paid the bills, I took what I could get. The job as a night security guard at Maplewood General in Michigan wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was one of the quietest, loneliest jobs I've ever had. Mostly, it was just walking empty corridors, checking locked doors, and occasionally dealing with the occasional drunk or uncooperative patient wandering the halls. At first, it was dull. Too dull, actually, but that all changed during my 3rd week. Maplewood General was an old hospital, built back in the 1950s with a few modern additions over the years. The older part of the building was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms, most of which had long been shut down or converted into storage spaces. The night staff told me to avoid the East Wing, the oldest section, as it had a history that made the other staff uneasy. They called it the Forgotten Wing. But of course, sometimes my patrols required me to check those areas. The first strange thing I noticed was the way the East Wing felt different from the rest of the hospital. While the newer sections smelled like antiseptic and had bright fluorescent lights, the East Wing was cold and the air felt heavier, like something lingering just beneath the surface. The lights flickered constantly, and the hallways echoed too much, as if sounds didn't belong there. On my 2nd night there, I passed by room 27T, a room that had been sealed for years, and caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement or a shadow that wasn't mine. I stopped, but nothing was there. I chalked it up to fatigue. One night, about 2 weeks into my job, that something happened that I still can't explain. It was around 3:30 a.m., and I was on my usual patrol through the East Wing. The hallway was dim, the buzzing of old lights filling the silence. As I rounded the corner near the stairwell, I heard soft crying coming from one of the rooms. The door was slightly ajar. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But there was no answer. The crying stopped abruptly. I hesitated before pushing the door open, but the room was empty. Just a small bed with wrinkled sheets and an old rocking chair. I noticed the chair rocking gently back and forth on its own. No windows were open, and the air was still. My heart pounded. I closed the door quickly and stepped back into the hallway. When I looked again, the chair had stopped moving. That night, as I walked past that room again, I heard a faint whisper, "Help me." I spun around, but the corridor was empty. I told my supervisor about it, but she just gave me a tired smile. This place has its stories. Just keep your head down. Over the next few nights, the experiences escalated. I started hearing footsteps behind me when no one was there, and once as I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a woman in a nurse's uniform from decades ago. When I blinked, she was gone. Sometimes the intercom would crackle with static, and I'd hear fragments of old conversations or soft singing. One night, the elevator near the East Wing stopped working while I was inside it alone. The lights flickered, and I could swear I heard a voice whisper, "Don't leave me." The elevator jolted suddenly, then started moving again. My nerves were frayed, but the job paid the bills, so I kept going. I did some digging in the hospital archives and learned that the East Wing had once been a psychiatric ward in the 1950s and 60s. There had been a series of patient deaths, some labeled accidents, others suspicious. Staff had reported strange behavior, and some had left abruptly. The wing was closed in the 70s and never fully reopened. One night, while checking the basement for a routine door lock inspection, I found a small room that wasn't on any current floor plan. Inside was an old cot and a faded photograph of a young nurse. The air was frigid. I heard a soft tapping, then a faint voice saying, "Stay with me." I left quickly, but kept the photograph. The strange encounters tapered off after a while, but I quit the job a few months later. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched or that something was trying to communicate, trapped somewhere between this world and the next. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear soft crying or a whisper when I'm alone in old buildings. Maybe it's just my mind, but maybe some places never forget. Story the end. The first time I saw her, I thought she was a patient who had gotten lost. It was around 2:30 in the morning, the part of the night shift, when time slows down and the fatigue begins to creep in like fog through an open window. I was working as a floor nurse in a mid-sized hospital in western Pennsylvania in the long-term care wing where most patients were elderly, many of them in various stages of dementia or recovery from strokes. It had been a quiet shift so far. My coworker Tanya was in the break room eating reheated spaghetti, and I was doing my rounds, checking vitals, restocking gloves, and adjusting beds. I had just finished with Mr. Laird, an old man who used to be a high school chemistry teacher and who now barely remembered his own name. As I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, I saw her at the far end, standing in front of room 209. She was facing the door, not moving. Her hospital gown looked dirty, like it hadn't been changed in a while, and her long, dark hair hung over her shoulders in stringy clumps. I called out gently, "Ma'am, do you need help finding your room?" She didn't answer or move. I thought maybe she was hard of hearing or confused, so I walked down the hall towards her. The hallway was silent except for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights and the faint beeping of a monitor from a nearby room. As I got closer, I noticed that I couldn't hear her breathing. That struck me as strange, and I slowed my approach. When I was about 10 feet away, she turned around. Her face was pale. Not pale in the way sick people are pale, but pale like wax or old paper. Her eyes were completely black, not dark brown, not dilated pupils, just black. I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't know what I was looking at. I started to say something, but then she opened her mouth and let out a long, breathless whisper. I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like multiple voices layered over each other, a deep, rattling murmur that didn't seem possible for a human throat to produce. I backed up, heart hammering. The woman tilted her head, still staring, and then she turned and walked into room 209. I ran after her, but when I stepped into the room, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the lights off. Room 209 had been unoccupied for weeks after the last patient passed away in their sleep. I turned on the light, checked the bathroom, even looked in the closet. No one. Not a trace. I stood there in the middle of the room, trying to reason with myself. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe someone from another floor had wandered in, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't explain the eyes. Or that voice. I didn't say anything to Tanya. She was already talking about how creepy the hospital got at night, and I didn't want to feed into it. But the next night, I asked the day nurse about room 209. She said there was no current patient, but a woman had died there a few months ago. Her name was Helen Archer. She'd suffered from severe schizophrenia and was often found talking to herself in the dark, mumbling strange things in her room. She passed in her sleep one night. No warning signs. That could have been a coincidence. Hospitals have death in them all the time. But what happened the following week was not so easy to explain away. I was in the break room microwaving coffee. The TV was on mute, and Tanya was scrolling on her phone. The hospital radio crackled suddenly on the counter, something we kept around in case of code blues or emergencies, and we both froze. It was on, even though we hadn't touched it all night. There was no voice, just static. Then a low whisper came through, same as what I heard that night. That gurgling, multi-layered voice. Room 209. The hair on my arm stood up straight. Tanya looked at me and mouthed, "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly. We both went out into the hallway. Room 209's door was wide open. We approached slowly, my hands trembling. I don't know why I felt the need to go in, but I did. Inside, the lights were on. Not dim, not flickering, just on. And the bed? It was a mess. The blankets had been pulled down, the pillow tossed aside like someone had just gotten out of it. We both knew no one had gone in. We were the only staff on that wing for the shift, and no patients were assigned to 209. I shut the door and locked it. After that night, things started happening more frequently. Lights would flicker in that hallway, only between rooms 206 and 210. Nurses started reporting cold spots. One CNA, Devin, swore he saw someone standing in the corner of the break room one night, just watching him. He thought it was a homeless person who had snuck in, but the security footage showed no one there. Just Devin, looking at empty space and backing away slowly. I kept seeing the woman. Twice more. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. She never said anything else I could understand. Once she was sitting in a wheelchair, her head slumped forward, hair covering her face. Another time she was standing at the nurse's station, her hands pressed against the glass partition. Both times when I looked away and then back, she was gone. I started to dread my shifts. I needed the money, so quitting wasn't an option, but I began taking my breaks in the stairwell instead of the break room. Tanya did the same. Other staff members began trading shifts to avoid working nights altogether. One by one, most of the regular night crew left. I began keeping a notebook, writing everything down, no matter how minor. One entry read, April 19th, 2:11 a.m. Heard humming coming from 209. Sounded like, "You are my sunshine. Room is still locked. Door not open." Another entry, April 25th, 2:44 a.m. Black-haired woman standing in hallway again. Appeared to be crying, no sound, dissolved when I turned on hall lights. I tried getting a priest to bless the room. Management wouldn't approve it, but I got one on my own time. Father Reynolds. He came one Sunday afternoon, said a quiet prayer in the doorway, sprinkled holy water. He looked uneasy the whole time and told me afterward, "There's something deeply wrong here. If you can leave this job, do it." But I didn't. Then came the worst night. It was May 9th, right in the middle of a storm. The power had gone out briefly, just long enough to make everyone nervous. When it came back on, the call light from room 209 lit up on the panel. I stared at it for a full minute. The door was still locked. I had the only key. Tanya wasn't working that night. I was alone. I walked to the room, the storm rumbling outside like distant cannon fire. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. The room was pitch black. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. Power must not have returned to that outlet yet. I pulled out my flashlight and scanned the room. The bed was empty, but the chair in the corner was turned toward the wall, and something about it felt off. I took a step in. The door slammed shut behind me. I screamed and dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning across the floor. I lunged for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle was ice cold. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. This was heavy, like someone with fluid in their lungs. I turned around slowly. She was standing by the bed, closer than she'd ever been. I saw her face clearly this time. Her skin was gray, her mouth slightly open, her tongue was swollen black as if she had died by choking or strangulation. Her eyes were weeping dark fluid, and when she took a step toward me, the room grew freezing cold. She raised one arm and pointed at the bed. Then, in a voice that seemed to erupt from the walls themselves, she said, "Lay down." I shook my head violently. "No," I whispered. "Please." She stepped closer. "Lay down." I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. No one ever came. I curled into the corner, covering my face, sobbing like a child. Then the lights came on. The door creaked open. A nurse from the ICU, Lisa, stood in the hallway, looking confused. "I heard screaming," she said. The woman was gone. Just like that. I transferred to day shift 2 weeks later. I couldn't take another night on that floor. I still work in the same hospital, but I never go near room 209. It's been boarded up now, supposedly for renovations, but nothing's ever been done to it. No equipment, no contractors, just a locked door. Every now and then, in silence, I'll see someone standing at the end of the hall, staring at that room, and I look away because I know who it is. Story the end.